Hello and welcome to the Afternoon Agenda on GB News with me, Alex Phillips. Now, this show is all about your opinion and mine. So it's not news as you know it, but discussion and debate on things that are or need to be on your agenda. So with that in mind, here's what we're covering today. Is it time for Plan B? New COVID restrictions are imminent as the government tries to control the spread of Omicron. The Foreign Secretary sets out her ambitions for a global network of liberty. What does that mean? And does Liz Truss also have ambitions to be Prime Minister? And it may not be on the agenda of traditional news outlets, but perhaps it's time we spoke about what's going on in France. Will relations across the Channel improve if Macron is ousted? That's the agenda for next hour. What's on yours? Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet to me @gbnews. But first, it's time for the headlines.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, I'm Simon Pusey, and this is your news at 4 o'clock. Allegra Stratton has resigned as an advisor to the Prime Minister, giving her profound apologies after a leaked video showed her joking about a Christmas party held in Number 10 during lockdown restrictions. In the video, obtained by ITV News, she laughs about cheese and wine during a mock briefing 4 days after the alleged event in December last year. At Prime Minister's questions, Boris Johnson said he was furious with the conduct of his staff and announced an investigation will be launched.
I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip. I've asked the Cabinet Secretary to establish all the facts and to report back as soon as possible.
Meanwhile, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has accused the government of lying.
They knew there was a party. They knew it was against the rules. They knew they couldn't admit it, and they thought it was funny. It's obvious what happened. The Prime Minister has been caught red-handed. Why doesn't he end the investigation right now by just admitting it, that we are facing a new variant? We may well be in Plan B this afternoon. Even the Prime Minister must understand the damage he's done to his credibility in enforcing the rules now and in the future.
Meanwhile, Cabinet Ministers are meeting in Number 10 to discuss COVID restrictions. Boris Johnson is believed to be considering orders to work from home and vaccine passports to manage the spread of the Omicron variant. Downing Street sources insist no decisions have been made yet. From today, if you're over 40 in England, you can now book your COVID booster jab 3 months after receiving your second vaccine. This change makes an extra 7 million people now eligible for the third jab. It's exactly a year ago to the day that the first coronavirus vaccine was given in the UK. Roughly 1,000 properties are without power after Storm Barra swept across the country. The power cuts follow Storm Arwen, which of course caused catastrophic damage to electricity networks. Flood warnings have also been issued across the UK, and a yellow weather warning for wind is in place across the west coast of Wales and southwest England until 6 p.m. tonight. Boris Johnson says there will effectively be a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, as UK ministers will not be attending. This follows Australia's decision to join the US in a diplomatic boycott of next year's Olympics over human rights concerns. Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison says it is the right thing to do. Despite the move, Australian and UK athletes will still be able to compete in the Games. The Mercedes Formula One team has ended its sponsorship deal with the insulation company Kingspan, following a backlash over its links to Grenfell Tower. Kingspan made some of the insulation at Grenfell, but says it was not involved in the design of the cladding system. 72 people were killed in a fire at the tower block in 2017. The UK and other Western countries say they will work together to encourage Russia to back down over what they are calling threatening behaviour towards Ukraine. Their talks follow a meeting between President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, in which the US warned of severe sanctions if Russia invades Ukraine. An estimated 100,000 Russian troops are now gathered on the Ukrainian border. You are right up to date, and now back to the afternoon agenda.
You're with the afternoon agenda now. In a moment, we will be talking about France as the presidential election campaign picks up pace. But with that big breaking news tonight that the government spokeswoman Allegra Stratton has quit over a mock press conference in which aides appeared to joke about a Downing Street party last Christmas. Let's go straight to Downing Street and our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, well, we expected heads to roll, didn't we? Are we expecting any more?
Yeah, indeed, it is maybe not a surprise that Allegra Stratton, who is an advisor to the Prime Minister, was his press secretary at the time when that video was filmed last year, has resigned. Are we going to see further heads? Possibly, probably, I would suggest, and that may be before that investigation by the Cabinet Secretary is concluded, though we've no timescale on whether that may happen. Of course, this is all about the possibility that there was a party in Downing Street last year which may well have broken the rules. Of course, the rules at the time suggesting that social gatherings, Christmas parties, were essentially not allowed. Well, Allegra Stratton has made a pretty emotional statement outside her house in the last couple of minutes. I'll just talk you through what she said. She said that my remarks seemed to make light of the rules which people were doing everything to obey. That was never my intention. I will regret those marks for the rest of my days. I offer my profound apologies to all of you at home for them. She goes on to say that to all of you who have lost loved ones and who endured intolerable loneliness and struggle with your businesses, I'm truly sorry. And this afternoon, I'm offering my resignation to the Prime Minister. So Allegra Stratton having to resign over this incident, but many questions do still remain about what precisely went on here on the 18th of December, but also, it must be said, Alex, about other potential parties that took place in Downing Street in November when the UK or England was in lockdown, and in December too, and questions about potentially was the Prime Minister in attendance at any of those parties. And all this comes, of course, while there is still speculation that further restrictions could now be imposed in England in the days to come. Just to say that you can probably pick up that there are protesters beyond the gates here in Downing Street raising a hell of a racket, playing party songs in protest about what may have gone on last year. And I think maybe some of the anger, maybe not necessarily amongst the public, who will be angered and upset maybe about the fact that a party took place here in Downing Street, but amongst the Conservative Party themselves, is that Downing Street the Prime Minister has spent the last week essentially denying that there was any party in number 10 and that all rules were obeyed. And now we've ended up in a situation where Allegra Stratton, his advisor, has resigned over making light about a party, and he's asked the Cabinet Secretary to launch an investigation into the party. I think, i.e., we conclude there probably was a party in Downing Street last year, and we're going to find out, either from the Cabinet Secretary or the police indeed, who are also investigating this, about whether the rules were broken indeed.
I mean, this is rather extraordinary, isn't it? Because one would assume if there was a party that happened in 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister would know. Maybe he wasn't invited at the time. No one can be sure of that until we get some sort of truth. But he must have known from those working with him that that party took place. And yet there's been ongoing denials. Is Boris Johnson's scalp itself up for grabs right now, do you think? Is this all part of ongoing faction fighting as well, both in the wider Tory party and in 10 Downing Street?
Yeah, I'm not at all sure. In fact, I would say I don't think this is going to be a resigning issue for the Prime Minister. Notable, of course, that the Labour Party, who've been pretty vociferous in attacking the Prime Minister today, have not called for him to resign, though the SNP have. Now, the Prime Minister himself, you're right, when you come to Downing Street, it's a pretty big building, it must be said. He's got a flat where he actually lives above number 11, but he's got a flat in this building. Is he aware potentially of all the functions that take place in it? Probably not, to be fair to the Prime Minister, Alex. There are an awful lot of functions and events that do take place, either with him not there or without his knowledge. His defence for what he's been saying over the last week is that he has sought assurances that no party was held here and that no rules were broken, and that he has had those assurances. In fact, he repeated that today. What has immediately led to Allegra Stratton's resignation is that video, which he said he was furious and sickened about, that it seemed to make light of COVID restrictions. But yeah, the bigger questions about whether there were more parties inside Number 10, maybe even inside the Prime Minister's flat itself, well, those questions very much remain to the fore. In terms of the wider Conservative Party, and I've spoken to an awful lot of Conservative MPs today, they are also flipping furious, if I'm honest, about the fact that they have yet again ended up talking about the government scoring an own goal in all of this. They wish the Prime Minister had been more open about this earlier. And there are seriously concerned that this is doing reputational damage to the Prime Minister, but to the government at large, that the public out there will be pretty angry that while they obeyed the rules, some of the Prime Minister's team may not have done. And also that opens up wider questions about if there are going to be further restrictions imposed on all of this, will compliance be as strong as it has been throughout the pandemic? And that is why the politics, in many ways, of this spill into real life, about why this is a really important fundamental issue. And I think this, we can see Allegra Stratton there, pretty distressed, tearful, in fact, making that statement outside her home a little earlier in the last hour or so, in which she offered her resignation to the Prime Minister. Difficult time for many involved in this, but as I say, this is where the politics bleeds into the reality, where there will be concern that when the Prime Minister and others call on all of us to comply with further rules in the days and weeks to come in the lead up to Christmas, that many may feel that actually it is one rule for politicians, for the Prime Minister, for others, and another rule for all of us at home. And that might make compliance a bit more difficult, which could be very tricky given the fears around the transmissibility of this new variant.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. I have a feeling this isn't going to be the last we hear of this particular party, and indeed a host of others, just waiting to be leaked to the press, no doubt. Darren McCaffrey, our political editor there. Well, let's have a little look at the footage that was leaked that has got the Prime Minister into hot water today.
I've just seen reports on Twitter that there was a Downing Street Christmas party on Friday night. Do you recognise those reports?
I went home. Hold on.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas?
What's the answer?
I don't know.
It wasn't a party, it was cheese and wine.
Just be clear, it's not.
Is cheese and wine all right?
No.
It was a business meeting.
I'm joking.
This is recorded. This fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
Not a good look, is it? Well, joining us now is the former Chief Press Officer at Number 10 and former Special Advisor to Amber Rudd, Mo Hussein. Mo, put yourself in the boots of the people who do the wheeling and dealing of 10 Downing Street right now. What would you be telling them to do? Come clean?
Well, yes. I mean, we've had over a week now of just denials and slightly burying heads in the sand, hoping this story will go away. And clearly it isn't going away, and it's in fact getting much worse. And actually the handling of this and nothing to see here, I don't think has helped that at all. There are real questions to be asked, and one person resigning, I don't think really changes that. So coming clean, being more transparent, if something has gone wrong, which it very much looks like it has, admitting that and saying what you are going to do about it, I think all would be advisable right now.
It also raises serious questions, doesn't it, about the unity of the operation at the very heart of government, because this footage has been leaked by somebody. One assumes that there's only a few people who would have had access to that footage. And it's interesting to note as well, there are certain pixelated faces where it seems other people might have been ready to be thrown under the bus by their colleagues. What is going on in Number 10 at the moment? Have you got a whiff of an idea?
Well, I think there's probably underlying tensions that have been there for a while between different elements of Number 10. There's always, I spent 4 years there, there's always people who are closer to the Prime Minister and other people who aren't. And, you know, you may have a different view compared to another advisor in terms of what you want the Prime Minister to ultimately do. So there's always these kind of working, creative tensions going on. But this does seem a very well-timed leak. There may be more to come, but it seems to me that whoever has done this may well have just been annoyed about the fact that something very much looks like it's happened, yet it's being denied, it's being brushed under the carpet, and they felt the need to try and expose that, and that's probably why they've done it. I don't think it's just about Allegra, yes, she was featured quite prominently on this because she was at that point meant to be the Prime Minister's spokesperson. There are clearly other people involved as well, and there's bigger questions around who organised the party, who attended, why was it not cancelled, who knew what, when. So I don't think this really makes the issue go away at all.
I mean, people often call Boris Johnson the Teflon Prime Minister, don't they? Because it seems that whatever happens around him, his cohort might lose their heads, but he never does. But it beggars belief, surely, that the Prime Minister did not know during the course of the last week that there had been some form of a gathering or entertainment, or perhaps that even this footage existed. So how now will his reputation survive, both externally and, most importantly, perhaps internally within the party? Are there moves afoot already, the chattering backbenches to see the Prime Minister ousted?
Party management is really, really important. And if you look back over the last 4 to 6 weeks, it hasn't been great. There's been a series of unforced errors on behalf of the government, which have really, really annoyed MPs, having been marched up the hill to perhaps vote a certain way on something they didn't fully want to or fully agree with. And even on this incident, you've seen ministers and MPs being rolled out to say either that there was no party or all rules were followed. They clearly haven't been given the full information, so they will be annoyed about their personal credibility as well. And there's only so much goodwill and there's so much power that Number 10 can impose upon other people before people just say, we're not going to go and bat for you anymore. We're not going to go and defend this. I think the other challenge is really about what may come later on today in terms of further restrictions and compliance. Why will people listen to the government if they feel the government is not following its own rules? And this is also cutting through a lot as well. This isn't just a Westminster bubble story. I appreciate that not everyone follows the intricacies of high politics minute by minute, but you've seen that this is cutting through, and this again raises a challenge for the Prime Minister when we come to, for example, the North Shropshire by-election next week, and what impact this will have on just the government's ability to be credible and for people to actually listen and follow the government's message. So I don't think it's looking good for all those reasons.
Yeah, and I mean, a police investigation into the goings-on within 10 Downing Street must be fairly unprecedented. And I'm guessing as well that there are a lot of twitchy spads right now worried about what other parties may emerge. I've heard, whispers of rumours of Gavin Williamson having hosted an event. There's been footage of Jacob Rees-Mogg, which appears to seem as if he is also talking about the restrictions and the flouting of restrictions in a less than serious manner. Do we think that this is going to continue on and on over the next couple of days, if not weeks?
Yeah, I think it certainly will. There are certainly rumours of other parties and other gatherings. And the more this is in contrast with rising cases of the new variant and the possibility of new restrictions, the more this will be in focus as well. And I think it will be interesting to see just in terms of how the government's position on this now changes, because yes, there's an investigation, an internal one, that will buy a bit more time. And if you listen very carefully to what the Prime Minister and ministers have been saying, it's always a slightly one removed language, that they've been assured that the rules were followed or that there was no party, which in some ways seems a bit of a contradiction. But so who has been doing the assuring, and where did they get their information from, and have they themselves been given the right information? Because the point Darren made is right. Yes, while Number 10 isn't the biggest place of work and the biggest building, a lot of things happen in Number 10. The Prime Minister will not be aware of all of them. However, there will be people around him that are very close to him that will be, and it is their job to tell him also what is going on. So just exactly who was doing the reassuring and why that was perhaps taken at face value will be interesting to see.
Sajid Javid pulled from doing interviews this morning, empty-chaired by the BBC. This clearly is a topic that Downing Streets are having a lot of difficulty knowing quite how to approach. But this is really going to be a fly in the ointment, to frame it in terms of an understatement, of the government now in the run-up for Christmas making any sort of announcement about Plan B. Are we likely to see more from the Prime Minister actually talking to the country directly, do you think?
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister will have to do that. There's talk of a press conference at some point, and I think he will be more public-facing on that to try and sell this message around Plan B and around more restrictions. There are already a lot of people who don't want to see more restrictions. A lot of his own backbench MPs don't really like the approach the government has taken on this. And now coupled with this footage and coupled with the allegations being leveled against the government of hypocrisy, of one rule for you, one rule for other people, this will, I think, really, really hit compliance. And that in itself is clearly a very dangerous position to be in. So I think the government does have to sell this message, but how convincingly it can do that is a good question. And there's also a school of thought as to why this announcement is being made so suddenly today. One would hope it is because of the data and because of health reasons, but there are some suggestions that it could be a bit of a distraction from other things going on. I really hope that isn't the case, but what we saw this morning, no government minister on any broadcast at all. You know, the government still has to talk about the pandemic, which is going the wrong way, still has to talk about the booster jab. So I don't think that is the right approach either.
Yeah, I think we're going to be having an interesting run up to Christmas. Thank you ever so much for joining us, Mo Hussein there. Well, there's still a lot more to come after a short break, including the latest news headlines. But first, here's the weather forecast.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Storm Barra is now filling. It's moving away, so the wind will ease through the rest of today, albeit relatively slowly. And there'll be further showers for a time overnight, but clearer spells emerging later as Storm Barra moves off the scene. Here it is, still a fairly deep area of low pressure, still bringing strong winds to the north and the west in particular, and still gusts of 50, 60 mile per hour across West Wales into the southwest for a time. Eventually, those winds will come down through the evening, but further showers are expected, primarily across parts of Wales, northwest England, West Scotland and northeast Scotland. In between, turning drier with clearer spells emerging. Northeast England, as well as central and eastern Scotland seeing the best of these, and in some sheltered spots, a touch of frost to begin things on Thursday. Where we get the frost, of course, it'll be bright skies, but an area of cloud, the last remnants of Barra, will be moving east through the day. One or two showers associated with that, but by lunchtime, actually, much brighter skies for eastern areas, whilst further west, it turns cloudier once again, with outbreaks of rain moving in as the next weather front pushes through. That contains milder air, so 12 Celsius in the southwest, whilst it stays on the cold side further east. And all of us will see a spell of rain as that moves across the country later Thursday, before eventually, by around midnight or the early hours of Friday, it does clear into the North Sea. It's followed by showers in the west, clear spells elsewhere, a keen breeze, so most places will see a chilly but generally frost-free start, I think, on Friday. Best of any sunshine on Friday across central and eastern parts of the UK. Thicker cloud elsewhere and frequent showers pushing into the west first thing, with hail and thunder in places, snow over the mountains of Scotland and northern England. And then on Saturday, a chilly start to the day before rain arrives later, much milder in the south by Sunday.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says an investigation will take place into what may or may not have happened after allegations that Number 10 held a Christmas party while millions of us were living in lockdown last year. In Prime Minister's questions this lunchtime, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer responded by telling MPs that Johnson is taking the public for fools.
I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip. I've asked the Cabinet Secretary to establish all the facts and to report back as soon as possible.
Well, Cabinet Ministers then left the debates to urgently discuss the spread of Omicron, with the government expected to announce new COVID measures that may include working from home and vaccine passports. Our reporter Alice Porter takes a look at the events which have led to this resignation.
December 2020, a time when Christmas parties was something most people couldn't even contemplate. But was it a different story at Downing Street? That's the question that has gripped Westminster and now the country. It all began more than a week ago, when the Daily Mirror published allegations that parties were held at Number 10 over the festive period. It said, at the end of November, Boris Johnson allegedly attended a leaving party during the second national lockdown, when indoor social gatherings were banned and police were looking for rule breakers. Then 2 weeks later, on the 16th of December, Boris Johnson announced that London and the South East was moving into Tier 3, which were the toughest restrictions at the time. Indoor social mixing was only allowed between individual households. 2 days later, on the 18th of December, a staff party was allegedly held inside Downing Street. Government guidance at the time stated that people must not have a work Christmas party.
I know how much emotion people invest in this time of year and how important it is, for instance, for grandparents to see their grandchildren, for families to be together. So I know how disappointing this will be. But we have said throughout this pandemic that we must and we will be guided by the science.
Boris Johnson announced that the relaxation of the rules across England for Christmas would not go ahead as planned. And in fact, tougher restrictions would come into force for London and South East England with a new Tier 4, effectively cancelling Christmas for millions of people. These Tier 4 restrictions came into force on the 21st of December. People are forbidden from mixing indoors with anyone from outside their household. Only a day after new measures came into force and 4 days after the alleged party, a mock televised press briefing is held at Downing Street, in which an advisor to the PM is seen joking with Allegra Stratton about the party.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas?
What's the answer?
I don't know.
It wasn't a party, it was cheese and wine.
Just be clear, it's not. Is cheese and wine all right? No. It was a business meeting.
I'm joking.
This is recorded. This fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
Over the last week, the Prime Minister has repeatedly denied allegations that any rules were broken.
All guidance was followed completely during Number 10. All the guidelines were observed, continue to be observed.
Today, however, a U-turn. He's announced the Cabinet Secretary is to investigate claims of the party.
I was also furious to see that clip.
This scandal throws into doubt the trust between the government and its people, a trust which was even more crucial during the pandemic and is now very much under threat. Alice Porter, GB News.
Well, the then Prime Minister's spokeswoman, Allegra Stratton, resigned in front of the press a little earlier today. And a quick warning, the following video contains flashing images.
The British people have made immense sacrifices in the ongoing battle against COVID-19. I now fear that my comments in the leaked video of the 20th of December last year have become a distraction in that fight. My remarks seemed to make light of the rules that people were doing everything to obey. That was never my intention. I will regret those remarks for the rest of my days, and I offer my profound apologies to all of you at home for them. Working in government is an immense privilege. I tried to do right by you all, to behave with civility and decency, and act to the high standards you expect of Number 10, rightly expect of Number 10. I will always be proud of what was achieved at COP26 in Glasgow and the progress that was made on coal cars, cash and trees. This country and the Prime Minister's leadership on climate change and on nature will make a lasting difference to the whole world. It has been an honour to play a part in that. I understand the anger and frustration that people feel. To all of you who lost loved ones, who endured intolerable loneliness and who struggled with your businesses, I am truly sorry. And this afternoon I am offering my resignation to the Prime Minister.
Well, an emotional resignation there from Allegra Stratton. So how will this affect the Conservative Party? I can be joined now by pollster Chris Curtis. We don't have Chris Curtis right now. In fact, we're going to speak, first of all, to Barry Gardiner, who is, of course, the Labour MP. Barry, are you rubbing your hands with glee that perhaps the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister might finally have their comeuppance? Or are you worried that there's going to be exposés of similar things going on in your party?
Look, of course, I'm not rubbing my hands with glee. I'm appalled at what's happened. But what I'm deeply concerned about is the chaos that seems to be at the heart of government in getting a proper message out to people this winter. You know, we can look back and we can say, well, there were clearly lies told. The Prime Minister should have come out the moment this went into the Mirror newspaper, and he should at that point have said, I will conduct a full investigation and be transparent about it. He didn't. He's lied about this. The key point, though, now is how is the government going to actually answer the central issues about keeping the public safe this winter when they have lost all trust?
Yeah, I mean, I've just done a bit of an audit on Twitter at the various responses knocking about, and there seems to be a mix of condemning the Conservatives for evident hypocrisy, but a lot of people queuing up to defend the Prime Minister, almost pointing the blame at members of the public who had gone along with following the rules. Do you think that this is going to create a significant public shift towards COVID anarchy?
Look, I sincerely hope not, because all that science tells us is that we cannot have COVID anarchy. And when, if there were to be COVID anarchy, then people would pay for it with lives. And it would be the most vulnerable in our communities who would be doing that. So I sincerely hope not. But what we're seeing here is the way in which the government treats the people of this country with contempt. And you can look and say just today, I think the government's own report has said that with the PPE contracts, there was £6.5 billion of fraud. This is the way in which the government fast-tracked mates and friends, people who had no experience of providing adequate PPE or even PPE at all. Sometimes there wasn't even a company set up there. They set up a shell company to do this. all of this money wasted, and it's about the way in which this government takes people for fools. They think they can get away with it, they can lie, they can cheat, they can do whatever they like, and we have to, as a public, we have to say our democracy must be better than this.
Barry, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your perspective today on this ever-emerging story. A lot more to come, isn't there? One rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. Well, we can now throw to the news headlines, and I will join you again shortly.
Thank you, Alex. I'm Simon Pusey. Here are your latest headlines. Allegra Stratton has resigned as an advisor to the Prime Minister and offered her profound apologies after a leaked video showed her joking about a Christmas party held in Number 10 during lockdown restrictions. In the video, obtained by ITV News, which was recorded 4 days after the alleged event in December last year, she laughs with other staff about cheese and wine. Boris Johnson has ordered an investigation and says if rules were broken, there will be disciplinary action. Meanwhile, Cabinet Ministers are meeting in Number 10 to discuss Plan B COVID restrictions. Boris Johnson is believed to be considering orders to work from home and vaccine passports to manage the spread of the Omicron variant. Downing Street sources insist no decisions have yet been made. From today, if you're over 40 years old in England, you can now book your COVID booster jab 3 months after receiving your second dose of the vaccine. It follows official figures showing 101 additional cases of the Omicron variant in the UK, with the total now reaching 437. Roughly 1,000 properties are without power after Storm Barra swept across the country. Flood warnings have also been issued across the UK, and a yellow weather warning for wind is in place across the west coast of Wales and southwest England until 6 p.m. Boris Johnson says there will effectively be a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, as UK ministers will not be attending. Australian and American diplomats are boycotting next year's Olympics over human rights concerns. Despite the move, Australian and UK athletes will still be able to compete in the Games. Well, that's it from me for now. I'll be back with a full news update at 5 o'clock.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Well, welcome back to the afternoon agenda on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we are discussing the resignation of Allegra Stratton following revelations of a leaked video of a mock press conference showing Downing Street staff making light of the fact that they appeared to have conducted a Christmas party last year when the rest of the public were being told to stay at home. So how will this affect the Conservative Party? I'm joined now by pollster Chris Curtis. Chris, it seems to me that the government have had a whole slew of peccadillos ever since the start of the COVID-19 crisis, and yet the opinion polls don't really reflect perhaps what has been a bit of an onslaught of accusations and scandal, and especially when it comes to Teflon Boris, a lot of the public still jumping up in his defence.
Look, I do think it's true that Boris Johnson has faced more than his fair share of scandals, and in most cases a lot of them do seem to have bounced off him. I'm still not convinced that this is going to be one of those things that does cut through. However, there's lots of reasons to think that that this one might actually be something that makes a difference, even if previous scandals haven't. One of the reasons for that is a lot of the scandals that previously took place were happening right in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic or the vaccine rollout. And at those times, the public were telling us that they were willing to give the government the benefit of the doubt. They appreciated the difficult situation they were in. Now we started to move to a different stage of the pandemic. I don't think that benefit of the doubt is quite there as much. And therefore, they might find things a bit more difficult and things might start to cut through a little bit more. We've also run a snap poll today, and I think it's fair to say that trust in the government is not particularly there from voters. There are fewer members of the public that believe what Boris Johnson is saying about this story. More people think that the moon landings were faked than think the Prime Minister is telling the truth about this story. So I think that basically indicates that, as we've seen contradictory lines and going backwards and forwards on this story, the public are out of patience when it comes to what Boris Johnson's saying here.
Yeah, Boris Johnson seems to preside over quite an interesting dichotomy, which is that I think most of the general public don't really take his word as truth. And yet a lot of people are still rather enamoured with him. It seems to me that any sort of protest against the Prime Minister is most likely to come from within the party itself. And yet I fear that there's probably going to be further revelations about other parties that have taken place, the other side of the Commons perhaps. Do you think that you're expecting to see polling shift significantly this Christmas, or has Boris essentially established a pattern now where he somehow survives this stuff?
Well, look, I don't think we should see Boris Johnson as magic or mythical. Things do still have an impact on him. I think basically what we've seen in his premiership is the first few months he was dealing with Brexit. The following year after he won that election in 2019, he was dealing with a pandemic. He hasn't yet faced politics as normal, so to speak, where these kind of scandals are more likely to have an impact. So if we are going into a period where politics is behaving more normally without these big dramatic events like Brexit or coronavirus, potentially these things will have a bit more of an impact. And it is also worth knowing that he isn't incredibly popular. Far more people disapprove of the job he's doing than approve. Our opinion poll out today showed that the majority of the country, for the first time, a majority think that he should resign from the job that he's doing. The vast majority don't trust and believe that what he says. So he isn't a particularly popular politician. And these things are still having an impact.
But is he rather saved somewhat by the fact that despite what goes on at government level, despite issues with Matt Hancock, Dominic Cummings, this Christmas party, and more issues that are bound to come in the wake of this, that the Labour Party just don't seem to be able to land a blow? They're reactive. They jump on issues every time issues pop up and say, well, we would have done better. But it seems to me that the general public aren't buying that line either.
I think that's true. I think there's a sort of expectations game going on here. What we've seen consistently in polling and focus groups that we've run on a lot of these scandals is lots of people will reply to us saying, well, they're all as bad as each other, and they'll tell us that actually they wouldn't expect Labour to do any better job were they in government. Labour's still not done a particularly good job at convincing voters that they would be any better and that they would be better behaved, for example. And I think Labour also has two particular issues that they still need to overcome despite all this stuff. Firstly, people do view Keir Starmer as competent, but they also view him as not necessarily a strong enough person for the top job. And secondly, people don't trust Labour to run the economy, despite the fact that we're over 15 years, nearly 15 years from the financial crash. So they're the two big problems Labour need to overcome. Now, those arguments will be easier when the Conservative is mired in scandal like this, but the Labour Party's still got a lot of work to do to make those arguments if they want to stand a chance at winning the next election.
Last time we saw big issues cut through the core of government, the Brexit, for instance, that neither side seemed to be able to convince the general public they were capable of handling. We saw the emergence of smaller parties suddenly getting traction when it came to polling and in certain elections, especially those conducted under proportional representation. Are we likely to see something similar happening in the new year, do you think? If the Labour Party can't make clear headway at the head of a government that has been embroiled in so much scandal, then is the mantle essentially going to start being split and passed around with smaller outfits?
I mean, it's worth saying that there's no issue in politics which quite divided, at the moment, that quite divided the public as much as Brexit did in 2019. Both parties, to a certain extent, had to try and sort of go for the middle ground. Labour trying to go for a soft Brexit position, the Conservatives under Theresa May trying to go to a soft Brexit position. And that just meant that there was massive flanks on both sides, a hard Brexit position from the Conservatives and a let's stay in the European Union position on the Remain side that basically led to this fragmentation in parties that they had to then piece back together by changing their Brexit positions. I don't think there's quite an issue that is so divisive among the public at the moment as Brexit was in 2019, but there are two things to consider. Firstly, politics is a lot more volatile than it used to be before. We used to have the situation in the 80s and the 90s where people were generally loyal to a political party. Most people voted the same way in each general elections. Now voters do take more of a sort of compare the market approach to voting in elections, and that means that we are far more likely to see the rise of smaller parties. And secondly, I think particularly for the Conservatives, what we've seen is the issue of immigration cropping up. Conservative voters now say it's one of the most important issues facing the country. It's more important, for example, than the economy to them. And they generally think that the Conservatives are doing a bad job at handling it. So if we do see a new party appear in that space, potentially with Nigel Farage at the helm, that could possibly start to take some of those voters away from the Conservatives again.
Chris Curtis, thanks very much. I think Nigel Farage might be rather busy with GB News at the moment, but when I speak to him later, I'll ask him his plans and let you know. Chris Curtis there, who's a pollster. The government has spent the day insisting that no decisions have been made on new COVID restrictions yet, their so-called Plan B, which would help, they say, stop the spread of the Omicron variant. Plan B includes the recommendation to work from home and could involve introducing vaccine passports. It's been reported that the Prime Minister backs the introduction of the restrictions and he was due to give an update to the nation in the next hour. We're waiting to see if that still takes place. Well, let's talk now to Professor Hugh Pennington, Professor of Bacteriology at the University of Aberdeen. Are you worried by Omicron? Or we've been told a lot of mixed things. One is that it's very mild, almost asymptomatic. Two, that it's highly contagious. C, that it might evade the vaccine. So it seems like using the blunt tools of old to prevent the spread or prevent what we were told, excess hospitalisation to protect the NHS, might seem like a bit of a blunt instrument and rather heavy-handed.
Well, yes. I think the essential question really is this virus, is Omicron nastier than Delta in terms of putting people into hospital and putting people into ICUs and killing them? And we don't know that yet, and it may not be. That would be very good news if it wasn't, even if case numbers were very high. But of course, if case numbers are very high and it's even marginally nastier than Delta, that's going to put enormous pressure on the health service, and it's unfortunately going to lead to more deaths. So, but the jury's out on that. Well, not the jury. We're just waiting to see what happens until Omicron has been around enough to infect enough older people who are the ones who are really susceptible to having a nasty time with this virus, to see what happens. And it's too early to say. There are sort of straws in the wind that it might not be as nasty as Delta. And if that's the case, I would be very, very pleased, because we could then cope with a surge in cases better than we could with a surge in cases in Delta. But we don't know yet whether that's going to be the case. Clearly, it gets around very easily. And it's going to be really very difficult to control. We found that with Delta, not so much in the UK. We've had a big wave with Delta, but countries that have tried to keep it out, like New Zealand and China, Delta got through the borders and got in very easily and caused outbreaks. So, Delta's been a big problem in that respect, that it's not really obeying the controls as well as we would like. And Omicron will probably be slightly cleverer at getting through the controls. Now, having said that, some of the controls, like not meeting with lots of strangers in a crowded place where everybody's jumping up and down, heavy breathing. We know that is the best way to catch the virus if somebody's in there with the virus. And that's why, vaccine passports are something to consider. But of course, it depends on how well they can be run and all that kind of thing. One thing that will be possibly effective in reducing case numbers a bit is wearing masks more often than people do at the moment. And of course, that, generally speaking, doesn't affect people. If you're on the tube wearing a mask, well, you're less likely to infect somebody than if you're not wearing a mask. So that's the sort of thing that we should be looking for. And that really doesn't affect people's work anywhere near as much as working from home, which, of course, reduces the number of people who are commuting. So all these things have to be taken into account. But none of them are a silver bullet. None of them are going to reduce case numbers very significantly. They'll reduce case numbers a bit. And of course, a lot really will depend on the data telling us whether Omicron is nastier or just as nasty or even less nasty than Delta. And let's hope it's less nasty, in which case we might get away with it in the sense of we'll still unfortunately have people falling really sick. But on the other hand, the numbers won't be, rocketing like they did last year. The big problem for the government.
I have one more burning question, which no one's been able to give me the answer yet. Are people getting reinfected if they've already had COVID? Because just doing a sort of, simple survey of the people I know, every man and his dog seems to have had COVID now, but no one seems to have had it twice, including me. Are we potentially looking at a situation where natural immunity is better than vaccines?
Well, people can get reinfected after they've had a natural infection, usually we've known that for more than a year, that this was happening with the very early variants. This was happening, and it seems to happen quite a lot with Omicron, that if you had an infection 6 months or a year ago, you can get infected with Omicron quite easily, and that seems to be one of the features of what's been happening in countries like South Africa. And basically that's telling us that, well, your immunity has waned. If you had an infection a year ago, your immunity won't be anywhere near as good as if you were infected a couple of weeks ago, or if you had the booster 3 weeks ago, in which case you'll have the top level of immunity. So a lot of it is down to the decline in the immune response, plus the fact that none of the vaccines give you 100% protection. They give you 90% at the best. Well, that means that 10% of people might get the infection, and so on. And we know that that's an issue, and that's been an issue the whole time. So that's another question we really need a firm answer to, is how good is Omicron at getting around the immune response? And it's reasonable to guess, and on the basis of the evidence, the guess is probably going to be correct, but it's still going to be a guess, that having the booster and having top-level immunity, even if you had a natural infection as well, is going to give you the best possible chance of escaping being infected with Omicron. So that's really why there has to be the big emphasis on the booster, because that will, get your immune response at the top level. And even if Omicron is better at getting through the immune response than Delta or the previous variants, it will give you a very substantial amount of protection. That's the best guess. And I've seen no evidence to suggest that guess is wrong.
Professor Pennington, thank you so much for giving us your expert insight. Now, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss appears to be impressing many Tory MPs lately, with some going as far as setting up a WhatsApp group backing her to become the Conservative Party's new leader. The group, Liz for Leader, contains new Red Wall MPs who are concerned that Prime Minister Boris Johnson's leadership may cause them to lose their seats in the next general election. Well, joining us now is Telegraph columnist Juliet Samuel. Juliet, Liz for Leader, it seems strange to me that the Red Wall were the people who backed Boris. I would suggest, on the weight of his personality and an almost sort of football fervour fan following, do we really think that Liz Truss could be the person to save the Tory party if things start to change?
I think that there's a lot of, I think what this WhatsApp group being set up and discussions of this type really are more an indicator of people's dissatisfaction and MPs' frustration and fury with the current leadership than something that is actively about to happen. I do think that Liz Truss has things to recommend her to MPs and to the Conservative Party that Boris doesn't. Namely, she has very strong values, very strong convictions, and she sticks to them. And she's also not put a foot wrong in terms of inviting these sorts of scandals, whether it's the Owen Paterson corruption type scandal or some of the hypocrisy that we're seeing at the moment. However, I think on the other side to that, we saw with Theresa May that you don't really know how great a leadership candidate is until they're tested in an election. And we've never really seen Liz Truss really out there winning an election, winning voters over. She doesn't have that charisma, the exceptional charisma that Boris Johnson has. So I think it might be a case of the grass is greener on the other side, So I think that there's it's a measure of the dissatisfaction, but it's not necessarily something that's imminent or realistic at the moment.
Looking at today's story as well, it seems to me Boris stays in place while yet another member of his coterie has fallen on their sword. Is it right that Allegra Stratton has resigned and seemingly been the scapegoat in all this? Because it beggars belief to me that one woman alone organised, conducted a party, joked about it, and should take the cop for it.
Well, I think that Allegra Stratton's resignation was probably her own recognition that she had become the face of this scandal, at least for the moment. But yes, I think it's deeply unfair in the sense that what should actually have happened was a proper inquiry into what exactly took place, who organised it, who was in charge of it, what roles did different people play, and then accountability on that basis rather than on the basis of some leaked footage and, something, Downing Street essentially trying to dampen this down in the moment. So I think it's unfair. On the other hand, this is what happens when you have a government that is trying to weather out incredibly a moral crisis of this kind without really tackling the issue or taking it seriously.
Yeah, Juliet Samuel from The Telegraph, thank you so much for your commentary today. Well, it seems to me there's so many inquiries taking place into how the government should have governed. One wonders where they find the time to actually govern. It's a question I would love to see answered in the new year. Well, there's lots more still to come after a short break. But first, let's have a little look at the weather forecast. Something tells me it's not going to be good news.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Storm Barra is now filling. It's moving away, so the wind will ease through the rest of today, albeit relatively slowly. And there'll be further showers for a time overnight, but clearer spells emerging later as Storm Barra moves off the scene. Here it is, still a fairly deep area of low pressure, still bringing strong winds to the north and the west in particular, and still gusts of 50, 60 mile per hour across West Wales into the southwest for a time. Eventually, those winds will come down through the evening, but further showers are expected, primarily across parts of Wales, northwest England, West Scotland and northeast Scotland. In between, turning drier with clearer spells emerging. Northeast England, as well as central and eastern Scotland seeing the best of these, and in some sheltered spots, a touch of frost to begin things on Thursday. Where we get the frost, of course, it'll be bright skies, but an area of cloud, the last remnants of Barra, will be moving east through the day. One or two showers associated with that, but by lunchtime, actually, much brighter skies for eastern areas, whilst further west, it turns cloudier once again, with outbreaks of rain moving in as the next weather front pushes through. That contains milder air, so 12 Celsius in the southwest, whilst it stays on the cold side further east. And all of us will see a spell of rain as that moves across the country later Thursday, before eventually, by around midnight or the early hours of Friday, it does clear into the North Sea. It's followed by showers in the west, clear spells elsewhere, a keen breeze, so most places will see a chilly but generally frost-free start, I think, on Friday. Best of any sunshine on Friday across central and eastern parts of the UK. Thicker cloud elsewhere and frequent showers pushing into the west first thing, with hail and thunder in places, snow over the mountains of Scotland and northern England. And then on Saturday, a chilly start to the day before rain arrives later, much milder in the south by Sunday.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Join me, Nana Aquila.
We're on Fridays, Saturdays and Sunday afternoons here on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as my panel and I take on some of the top stories hitting the headlines.
You can look up the statistics.
No, you look it up. I hug everyone I We'll learn from it and try and move on. That's it. Opinion is at the heart of the show. It's a place for open and frank conversation, but without the fear of cancellation. So join me here on GB News on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons between 4 and 6 p.m.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Pusey. This is your news at 5 o'clock. Allegra Stratton has resigned as an advisor to the Prime Minister after a leaked video showed her joking about a Christmas party held in Number 10 during lockdown restrictions. In the video, obtained by ITV News, she laughs with other staff about cheese and wine during a mock briefing 4 days after the alleged event in December last year. At Prime Minister's questions this lunchtime, Boris Johnson said he was furious with the conduct of his staff and announced an investigation will be launched. Hours later, his former aide offered her profound apologies along with her resignation.
The British people have made immense sacrifices in the ongoing battle against COVID-19. I now fear that my comments in the leaked video of the 20th of December last year have become a distraction in that fight. My remarks seemed to make light of the rules that people were doing everything to obey. That was never my intention. I will regret those remarks for the rest of my days, and I offer my profound apologies to all of you at home for them. Working in government is an immense privilege. I tried to do right by you all, to behave with civility and decency, and act to the high standards you expect of Number 10, rightly expect of Number 10. I will always be proud of what was achieved at COP26 in Glasgow and the progress that was made on coal cars, cash and trees. This country and the Prime Minister's leadership on climate change and on nature will make a lasting difference to the whole world. It has been an honour to play a part in that. I understand the anger and frustration that people feel. To all of you who lost loved ones, who endured intolerable loneliness and who struggled with your businesses, I am truly sorry, and this afternoon I'm offering my resignation to the Prime Minister.
I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip. I've asked the Cabinet Secretary to establish all the facts and to report back as soon as possible.
Well, meanwhile, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has accused the government of lying.
They knew there was a party. They knew it was against the rules. They knew they couldn't admit it, and they thought it was funny. It's obvious what happened. The Prime Minister has been caught red-handed. Why doesn't he end the investigation right now by just admitting it, that we are facing a new variant? We may well be in Plan B this afternoon. Even the Prime Minister, must understand the damage he's done to his credibility in enforcing the rules now and in the future.
Well, in other government news today, Cabinet Ministers are meeting in Number 10 to discuss COVID restrictions. Boris Johnson is believed to be considering orders to work from home and vaccine passports to manage the spread of the Omicron variant. Downing Street sources insist no decisions have yet been made. From today, if you're over 40 in England, you can now book your COVID booster jab 3 months after receiving your second vaccine. This change makes an extra 7 million people now eligible for the third jab. It's exactly a year ago to the day that the first coronavirus vaccine was given in the United Kingdom. Roughly 1,000 properties are without power after Storm Barra swept across the country. The power cuts follow Storm Arwen, which caused catastrophic damage to electricity networks. Flood warnings have also been issued across the UK, and a yellow weather warning for wind is in place across the west coast of Wales and southwest England until 6 p.m. Boris Johnson says there will effectively be a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, as UK ministers will not be attending. This follows Australia's decision to join the US in a diplomatic boycott of next year's Olympics over human rights concerns. Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison says it is the right thing to do. Despite the move, Australian and UK athletes will still be able to compete in the Games. The Mercedes Formula One team has ended its sponsorship deal with the insulation company Kingspan following a backlash over its links to Grenfell Tower. Kingspan made some of the insulation at Grenfell, but says it was not involved in the design of the cladding system. 72 people were killed in a fire at the tower block in 2017. Well, that's it from me for now. I'll bring you the headlines in around half an hour's time. Until then, it's back to the afternoon agenda with Alex.
Hello and welcome. If you've just joined the afternoon agenda, it's all parties here today, I can tell you that much. I'm Alex Phillips. Now, this show isn't about news as you know it. We discuss and we debate the things that really need to be on your agenda. So, still to come this hour. Of course, Allegra Stratton quits. The government spokeswoman was caught on camera laughing about a Downing Street Christmas party. We'll be live in Westminster with all the reaction to that as it continues to unfold. Meanwhile, COVID Plan B is in the pipeline as the government tries to stop the spread of the Omicron variant. We'll bring you the latest, and the Prime Minister will be holding a press conference, we've just learned, at 6 o'clock. So we'll be bringing you that live too. That's the agenda, but what's on yours? Email me, gbnews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me at gbnews. Well, here we go. We've just gone 5 o'clock, and the breaking news tonight is, of course, that Allegra Stratton resigned in front of the press a little earlier. A quick warning, we're going to see that resignation now, and the following video does contain some flashing images.
The British people have made immense sacrifices in the ongoing battle against COVID-19. I now fear that my comments in the leaked video of the 20th of December last year have become a distraction in that fight. My remarks seemed to make light of the rules that people were doing everything to obey. That was never my intention. I will regret those remarks for the rest of my days, and I offer my profound apologies to all of you at home for them. Working in government is an immense privilege. I tried to do right by you all, to behave with civility and decency, and act to the high standards you expect of Number 10, rightly expect of Number 10. I will always be proud of what was achieved at COP26 in Glasgow and the progress that was made on coal cars, cash and trees. This country and the Prime Minister's leadership on climate change and on nature will make a lasting difference to the whole world. It has been an honour to play a part in that. I understand the anger and frustration that people feel. To all of you who lost loved ones, who endured intolerable loneliness and who struggled with your businesses, I am truly sorry. And this afternoon, I am offering my resignation to the Prime Minister.
Well, I'm joined now by our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, when the first head rolls, you know you've got a story, but is this really going to help matters ahead of what we've just learnt, that the Prime Minister is also going to be giving a press conference at 6 o'clock from Downing Street, no doubt on potentially unveiling Plan B to deal with Omicron? It's a bit of a messy situation he finds himself in this evening.
Yeah, indeed, certainly a difficult situation, Alex. Let's start with that news that's just emerged in the last couple of minutes that the Prime Minister is going to hold a press conference here in Downing Street within the next hour. We have seen Cabinet Ministers, including the Education Secretary, the Transport Secretary, the Health Secretary, come in and out of Downing Street this afternoon. It is clear that there has been a very significant meeting and that we are expecting at 6 o'clock to hear probably that further restrictions are going to be imposed in England to try and tackle the Omicron variant that is continuing to grow. Over 500 cases across the UK. What does that mean in terms of restrictions? Well, it's still a long way off where we were this time last year, a long way off from lockdown restrictions. But what it does mean is that we could see vaccine passports introduced in England, i.e. that you will need to show that you are double vaccinated to get into large-scale events like football games, for example, and also that the government is likely to order people yet again to work from home. That will have a serious economic impact, not least of all on the hospitality industry, on bars and restaurants, who are already struggling with many people who've cancelled Christmas parties. And in addition to that, this is their best time of the year, isn't it, to a large degree? This is when bars and restaurants make an awful lot of money. It is one of the reasons that the pound this year has fallen to its lowest level that we've seen since January. So the Prime Minister likely to unveil that so-called Plan B in an hour's time. Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, simultaneously likely to make a statement in the House of Commons. But you're right, this feeds into a wider story of what politically is played out here in Westminster today about these allegations that a party was held in December of last year, in which Downing Street staff attended it, dozens of them, that there was frankly no social distancing, so the claims go, and that rules may well have been broken. Now, that video that emerged last night, leaked, has led to Allegra Stratton's resignation today. She says that she did not mean to make light of the rules and is profoundly apologetic. The Prime Minister at lunchtime said he was furious and sickened by the video, but those questions about the party on the 18th of December, well, they remain unanswered. We know the Cabinet Secretary is now launching an investigation into that, and there are other allegations that other parties may well have taken place in this building behind me in November and December last year, when we were all told they weren't allowed.
Interesting, isn't it? Because despite the first head having rolled, we still don't really know what on earth actually went on last year. The Prime Minister, is he going to be leading that press conference later at 6 o'clock? And is he going to open himself up to questions from the press? Because it struck me as quite remarkable this morning that all Cabinet members were pulled from doing interviews today in front of national media.
Yeah, indeed, Sajid Javid was meant to do the usual morning round of the TV and radio stations. He did not. You're right in pointing that out, Alex. We're told that's because the Prime Minister wants to make that announcement about the investigation by the Cabinet Secretary. Yes, the Prime Minister will lead that press conference. Yes, there will be questions from the press. I'm sure among them will be about trying to get more details when it comes to what may well have happened here last December. You're right in pointing out that the Prime Minister, of course, for the last week has told anyone who will listen to him that he has been assured time and time again that no party did take place. In fact, it is what he said again in the Commons today at PMQs. He said that he had sought assurances that there was no party, and as far as he is aware, there wasn't one. And yet we've ended up in this slightly peculiar situation in which one of his advisors has resigned, apparently making light of a party that apparently did happen, and also that he has launched an investigation to what precisely happened, which might lead you to conclude that there was some type of party here in Downing Street. Politically, is this damaging for the Prime Minister? I think to a large degree it is. In some ways, it may well be worse than what happened at Barnard Castle with Dominic Cummings last year. Will it make it more difficult to impose restrictions? Will compliance be hit amongst the public who think it is one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us? That is also entirely possible. And there are also, as I say, these other big, deep, fundamental questions about his political leadership in all of this. A lot of Conservative MPs very angry this afternoon about what has gone on here and how the government seemed to, yet again, have scored an own goal.
Darren, thank you ever so much for that update. We'll be catching up with you again, I'm sure, throughout the evening as you wait for that press conference to take place. The Prime Minister will be addressing the nation at 6 o'clock this evening to talk about new COVID restrictions, we're led to believe. Well, let's take a look instead at what Boris Johnson said at PMQs earlier today on the subject of the party.
I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip. I've asked the Cabinet Secretary to establish all the facts and to report back as soon as possible.
And let's also look at the response from Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
They knew there was a party. They knew it was against the rules. They knew they couldn't admit it. And they thought it was funny. It's obvious what happened. The Prime Minister has been caught red-handed. Why doesn't he end the investigation right now by just admitting it, that we are facing a new variant? We may well be in Plan B this afternoon. Even the Prime Minister must understand the damage he's done to his credibility in enforcing the rules now and in the future.
Well, joining us now is Ben Harris-Quinney, who's chairman of the Bow Group, which is a Conservative think tank. Ben, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because Boris Johnson does seem to have this infallible reputation that whatever befalls those around him, he somehow survives. But is there a risk now that brand Boris is increasingly associated with flippancy and frivolity and essentially being rather feckless?
Well, I think we spoke about this just last week, Alex, where I used the example of the once Teflon Tony Blair, once the wonder kid that could do no wrong and get away with absolutely anything. And that went for a while, and then suddenly it wasn't the case. And I think, Boris Johnson is really testing the limits of the public's tolerance for his buffoonery, his often amiable act. But in serious times, I think there is a real sense that he lacks the leadership, he lacks the stoicism, and he lacks the understanding of the public, quite frankly, of what is required in such moments. And, I have talked for quite some time about the what I can only describe as an oligarchy that has grown up around number 10 Downing Street, involving a lot of the figures within it. I think a lot of these scandals that Boris gets into don't have much to do with Boris himself, but don't fall too far from Boris either. And I think the whole culture that has gone on there over the last few years is utterly toxic. And there are a number of people in there that clearly feel that they are above the law and above public accountability. But usually the public eventually teach those people a lesson. And I think that will happen in this case. And I think people are extremely angry about this issue. And when the response from government and from Boris Johnson is people aren't interested in this, they're interested in us getting on with cracking crime and things like that, I think that's wrong. People have suffered horrific losses during this pandemic. We all have that image of Her Majesty the Queen sitting alone in the chapel at her husband's passing. I don't think many people would have begrudged her having a few people at her side for support. But that's what leadership looks like. She may not have agreed with the rules, but she understood that if there are to be rules, they have to apply to her like they have to apply to any citizen. And I think the lesson is there of what leadership and what stoicism and what direction and what this country is all about from Her Majesty the Queen. And I think that's quite the opposite of the lesson that the country is getting from Boris Johnson.
But arguably, that was always part of the Prime Minister's appeal, wasn't it? And it seems to me that there's a bit of a personality cult surrounding him when it comes to voters as well, and that when people are lodging attacks against the government, of which he is the leader, that people regard this as Boris bashing. And it seems to me that whatever happens, people are rather sympathetic, perhaps, with the fact that he isn't as stoical as other Prime Ministers and doesn't appear to take life as seriously. So is this going to create a long-term problem for the Conservative Party, do you think?
Yes, I think it does, because, as I say, I think that culture is toxic, and that kind of culture always ends in tears. It may go for 1 year, it may go for 10 years, but eventually it all collapses. And, I think the people involved, as with Tony Blair, are then forevermore held in very low regard by the public. I don't think Boris is going to get 10 years. I think people are getting very tired of it already. What I'm doing is not Boris bashing. Boris is the Prime Minister, so he has to take responsibility. But, as someone who knows something about the structure of things at Number 10 and how government works and how it intersects with Parliament, I think there is a much deeper problem at Number 10, and as I have said many times before, with the Prime Minister's wife and the people around her, and the authority she appears to have and the impunity that she appears to act with. So the buck stops with Boris because he's Prime Minister, but I think the entire culture at Number 10 needs to change, and change very quickly, unless the Conservative Party is going to suffer very severe negative results from it.
Let's stay on that subject at the moment, so this toxicity of culture at Number 10, because it's been framed in newspapers, for those who keep up to date with Westminster gossip and tittle-tattle, that the two figureheads really were Cummings versus Carrie Johnson. Now, we know Dominic Cummings has long since left and has been, sending bombs over the wall ever since. And now it seems that actually Allegra Stratton is one of Carrie's cohort, who has today resigned. So who is left in Number 10, who is perpetuating this infighting culture and perhaps perpetuating this sort of laissez-faire attitude towards sticking by the rules of the nation that this government are actually the ones authoring?
Well, one problem you had with the Carrie Symonds Dominic Cummings situation is that Dominic Cummings was an appointed government advisor. A lot of people say he wasn't elected, which he wasn't, but he was appointed by the government, and therefore he was legally accountable for his actions. Carrie Symonds, now Carrie Johnson, has been elected by no one. She is accountable to no one. And the question I asked earlier today, when Boris Johnson said there would be an investigation into who was involved in planning this party, who was at the party, who was involved in perhaps trying to cover up this party, and indeed we are told 2 other parties as well. What happens if that figure includes Carrie Johnson? What is the process then? Is she to be removed from Number 10 Downing Street because of her toxic effect on power? You mentioned Allegra Stratton, someone she was rumoured to be involved in hiring in Number 10, despite advice from other senior members of the government team. You might ask, and indeed I ask, why is the Prime Minister's girlfriend, as she...
We've just lost Ben there. And of course, I want to point out that we don't have Carrie here to give her right of reply to comments that Ben was making there. And I'm a big believer in being fair and making sure everybody can defend themselves. So just putting that out there about the Prime Minister's wife. Well, lots more still to come after the break. But first, we're going to have a little look at the weather forecast.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Gradually through the next 24 hours, the wind is going to ease. Showers will ease with a better chance of some sunshine in places by Thursday. However, some more rain will move in from the west later in the day. Storm Barra is filling and moving away. As a result, the wind, on the whole, starting to lessen during the next 24 hours. And any showery rain that's still wrapped around that area of low pressure will also tend to disappear. But it's going to take some time, so further showers in places through the central zones and northwestern areas overnight. A better chance, though, in places of some clear spells developing through the night. And with those winds coming down, A touch of frost possible for parts of northern England, Scotland, for example, Northern Ireland, where we get some shelter, where we get those clear skies. A bright but chilly start in these locations, and then the last of Storm Barra. This area of cloud and some showers moves east through Thursday morning, clearing by lunchtime, so a decent chance of sunshine in the east by the afternoon, whilst further west the cloud builds and another spell of rain moves in. It also brings milder air, 12 Celsius in the southwest, whilst it stays cold, 6 or 7 further east. And here's that band of showery rain. Nothing too problematic. It moves east for most places during Thursday afternoon and evening, clearing during the early hours, I think, from the far southeast. Then, once that's out of the way, we're into a clear spells and showery regime, with those showers pushing quite quickly into western areas, whilst clearing skies further east could lead to a touch of frost in some sheltered spots, but most places frost-free because of the breeze, I think, on Friday morning. The best of the sunshine on Friday will be in the east, perhaps the Midlands and southern England as well. However, in the northwest and west, we'll see frequent showers moving in, hail and thunder, snow over the mountains, and it will feel cold in the breeze. Saturday starts off chilly before rain arrives later, milder in the south on Sunday.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back to GB News with me, Alex Phillips. New coronavirus restrictions could be imminent. There's a press conference happening at 6 o'clock, which of course will be taking live. But Boris Johnson has said the Cabinet would be consulted before they're introduced in response to rising cases and the spread of the Omicron variant. The Prime Minister is believed to be considering measures including guidance to work from home and the introduction of domestic vaccine passports for events and large venues. Well, let's talk to the political commentator Richard Taylor about this and let's see if we can guess what's coming up at 6 o'clock. Richard, do you think that, that we're in a position where we should be imposing restrictions this winter, or are you a bit of a sceptic and think this could be a heavy-handed approach?
I'm not Richard Taylor, but...
Well, hi, Nick Eade. I can see now that you are not Richard Taylor. But you know what? Let's talk to you anyway. But let's not talk about the press conference and the Omicron, spread of the Omicron variant. Let's instead talk about what's been going on with these. Did they party or did they not party? It's a bit of a political storm, isn't it, for the Prime Minister at the moment? What would you be advising him on how to handle this? Because it seems to me the obfuscation and the circumlocution around whether or not this party took place has not played out well for him.
No, it hasn't. And the biggest problem is that he hasn't told the truth. And it's pretty obvious that everybody's covering for each other. And if I was advising him, I'd say you have to be honest to the British nation, to everybody, what actually went down there. You know, we had the police sort of saying that they weren't going to look at something retrospectively, when basically the police do that with every single investigation they do. And then suddenly you get people sort of circumnavigating around the truth. And then now we have that very incriminating bit of footage, which basically shows that something did actually occur at that time. And instead of actually taking it and saying, right, actually this did happen and everybody is accountable and we need to look at this in a massive way through the party, everybody is passing the buck, and it looks terrible from a PR point of view.
But in terms of Boris Johnson and brand Boris, and this sort of peculiar development of what's being called Boris bashing, that whenever something happens, some sort of peccadillo or scandal takes place in Number 10, we mustn't criticise the Prime Minister because it's not his fault. He's a good guy. He's on the side of the people. How on earth can someone wear this sort of cloak of infallibility for so long when they're leading a country? I bet all PR people wish they could bottle Boris and give it to their clients.
I mean, I do. I find it's flabbergasting, to be honest, how this has happened for so long and how he does get away with it. And I think this, you know, kind of is in many ways a nail on the coffin in many ways, because he has really shown himself and his sort of true colours. And there's nothing really to hide behind in this whole story. And I think this is going to be the undoing of him. And I think the whole sort of PR bubble that's been around him and the way that he's expressed himself all over for so many years is now going to crumble like, as they say, a house of cards.
Yeah, I mean, the people have been told since, well, the time that Boris first rocketed into public life, that he has a reputation for being duplicitous, for bending the truth, for making things up, for being light on detail, for being flippant, for inventing quotes in newspapers, which is an absolute journalistic no-no. And the public, however, with that in mind, with being told that, have still voted for him by a whopping majority, frankly, given previous elections in recent history. And that his opinion poll ratings have stayed relatively aloft throughout it all. Would the Conservative Party be minded to actually say, well, look, you know, for better or for worse, there is some magical power that Boris Johnson has that very few other leaders seem to possess, and that now jostling for position and talking about throwing him under a bus might not be wise?
I think there's an issue there, that he does have this bombastic attitude which somehow allows him to do things which other people would never be able to get away with. And he seems to have no accountability whatsoever. I think the Conservative Party, though, have to think about the long term, think about where they stand, what they stand for and who they stand for. And those people who want to be supporting them, the younger generation, are they really going to be supporting somebody like Boris? And if you have a look at social media today, it has exploded, erupted in all these memes to do with him. And it's not about Boris bashing, it's basically just showing him for who he is. And he's a bit of a buffoon when it comes to what's going on at the moment.
But what is the Conservative Party and how would they be best represented? Because it felt like when he came along and saved the day with Brexit, with his oven-ready deal, despite it being full of donkey meat, he still managed to get that one through Parliament and saved the day and brought the Conservative Party back together, essentially, after that really ugly schism over Brexit. Moving forward, who can actually be the flag bearer for conservatism in the UK, and who can be the one to bring their brand back to the very basics of conservatism?
I'm not the one to answer that one, because I actually, at the moment, if you looked at all of them, you wouldn't really be able to pick any of them that you would want to sort of lead that party. And I think if you are a part of that party, you need to actually sit back and look at the sort of the groundwork that you need to do to establish a really great base of people who want to support you and they believe in everything you say. And I think at the moment, you know, there's a lot of issue with all the political parties that people just don't really particularly trust what they're saying. And this is why Boris is being pretty bombastic in his attitude towards what happened at Number 10 during Christmas time. The issue is that if he is going to be bringing in restrictions potentially during the Christmas time, you know, will people want to, you know, adhere to that if they've seen the government doing what they did? Probably not. So he has a lot of work to do to get us on side.
Yeah, doesn't he just, Nick? Doesn't he just? Well, there you are. Nick Eade, who's a PR supremo, pointing out that things are going to get a little bit tough for the Prime Minister this Christmas time. Still to come on the afternoon agenda, it will be time to hear what you think about all the talking points today and whether or not the Prime Minister is in deep water. And what's your reaction to the resignation of Allegra Stratton? Was that deserved, or do you think she's been the fall woman? And frankly, it's unconscionable that organising, conducting, managing a party would fall on just one person's shoulders. Should more heads roll? Let us know. We always love to hear your views. But first of all, it's time for the news with Simon.
Thanks, Alex. I'm Simon Pusey, and here are your latest headlines. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson will hold a coronavirus press conference in half an hour after hosting a cabinet meeting earlier to discuss new COVID restrictions. The Prime Minister is believed to be considering orders to work from home and vaccine passports to manage the spread of the Omicron variant. Downing Street sources insist no decisions have yet been made. We'll bring you the statement live here on GB News when that happens. Allegra Stratton has resigned as an advisor to the Prime Minister and offered her profound apologies after a leaked video showed her joking about a Christmas party held in Number 10 during lockdown restrictions. In the video obtained by ITV News, which was recorded 4 days after the alleged event in December last year, she laughs with other staff about cheese and wine. Boris Johnson has ordered an investigation and says that if rules were broken, there will be disciplinary action. From today, if you're over 40 years old in England, you can now book your COVID booster jab 3 months after receiving your second dose of the vaccine. It follows official figures showing 101 additional cases of the Omicron variant in the UK, with the total now reaching 437. Roughly 1,000 properties are without power after Storm Barra swept across the country. Flood warnings have also been issued across the UK, and a yellow weather warning for wind is in place across the west coast of Wales and southwest England until 6 p.m. tonight. Boris Johnson says there will effectively be a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, as UK ministers will not be attending. Australian and American diplomats are boycotting next year's Olympics over human rights concerns. Despite the move, Australian and UK athletes will still be able to compete in the Games. Well, I'll bring you potentially a news update at the top of the hour. Potentially we'll go and see what Boris Johnson has to say. But for now, back to Alex.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Well, we're not budging from that big story of today, Partygate. Government spokeswoman Allegra Stratton has resigned over leaked video footage which showed her laughing with aides about a Christmas party at Downing Street last year. The Prime Minister has asked the Cabinet Secretary to investigate claims that the party took place. Speaking at Prime Minister's questions earlier on today, Boris Johnson told MPs he was furious about the footage and apologised unreservedly for the offence that it has caused. Well, let's talk to the political commentator, Richard Taylor, about this very story. Richard, are you livid? Is this driving you mad? Do you think Boris Johnson needs to stand down, or should we all just take a breath? We don't know what happened. We haven't been told. Allegra Stratton's resigned. Should we just move on by this point?
Well, Allegra Stratton has just been the scapegoat. Let's be completely honest here, Alex. And the truth is this, Boris Johnson has been caught with his pants down on this. Matt Hancock resigned over similar allegations, of course, of breaching COVID rules. And here we have his staff and his team doing it. And he said today in Prime Minister's Question Time that he didn't know it happened. Now, how many Christmas parties have you been to and you've worked for someone and your boss didn't know what you were up to? I mean, it's absolutely disgraceful, given the fact that millions of people sacrificed during that month of December. And I remember it well, where they couldn't see loved ones, couldn't attend funerals, cancelled operations, and here we have the elite think they know better than us and can do what they want, make the rules and break the rules without consequences. Although Boris has allowed an investigation to ensue, I've got very little faith in him, and I actually believe that his position is untenable and he should resign. Keir Starmer today, although all he asked for was an apology. He should have been calling, at least Ian Blackford, which I very rarely agree with, called for his resignation because it was absolutely appalling. And I think he's a disgrace to this nation, a disgrace to the country, and the man should resign.
Well, the difficulty is, of course, if people start calling for resignations, if more parties are unearthed, perhaps those that could have taken place among opposition benches, then we're going to have a bit of a cull, aren't we?
Well, yeah, but politicians have been elected by us and they're supposed to be people of integrity and people we trust. And public confidence, as I've noticed across social media on all platforms tonight, people are genuinely angry. I've been receiving messages relentlessly from people saying, I couldn't see my loved parent, my mother, my father, my grandmother, I couldn't go to their funeral, all while the Prime Minister of this country allowed a party to take place. Now, we don't even know if actually he was attended that party. I've heard from some sources that he slipped in and slipped out. I've also heard that the video was leaked by one of his cabinet members who might be challenging him in the future for his premiership.
Which cabinet member?
Richie Sunak.
Oh, is that right? Bit of a number 11, number 10 ding-dong you're hearing about there.
I've had several sources tell me this evening, Alex, that there are a number of people that believe that. Of course, I don't know if that's true, but obviously there is chatter amongst some of the people that I know that might be the case. If it is the case, and of course, I'm not sure that is the right way for the country to go in, but Boris is going to bury this. We've got this massive announcement coming up at 6 o'clock. He's going to bring vaccine passports in, which are completely, they make no sense whatsoever. They will punish industries such as the hospitality industry, such as the nightclubs and cinemas and such forth, as we've seen in Wales, and there is no evidential basis that they stop the spread. There is no benefit whatsoever. And I'm afraid that this government has lost the plot completely. And as I've said, Alex, at the start of the chat tonight, Boris Johnson needs to go.
Well, I mean, Boris Johnson is about to address the nation in just under 20 minutes about what we're expecting to be a new slate of coronavirus regulations. But he's going to have a big trouble selling those to the nation, isn't he? Because certainly on my movements around London, I'm not seeing many people abide by the new mask mandate that's come back in, with masks on public transports and in shops. And everyone seems to be back in the old normal without much appetite, really, for regressing back into the bad old days of social distancing and mask wearing and working from home. How on earth is he going to make this stick? Whatever Boris Johnson says tonight, are you going to go with the letter of the law and do as he says? Or are you going to say, well, why should I?
Well, I can assure you and your viewers, I will not be complying with any government legislation, given the fact that he has made a complete mockery of the regulations that he himself imposed upon the nation. And here in Wales, we've had the same as well. I have to say this, that ministers here in Wales back in December at the same time, round about the same time, they had a drinking party down at the Welsh Parliament. So it's not just in Westminster, it's here in the Welsh Parliament as well. And I'm afraid, Alex, that the public see through this and they have a sense that why should we do as we're told when those who make the rules are breaking the rules? Surely there comes a point where people say to themselves, I'm not going to listen. And people are not going to listen to Boris Johnson anymore. They're not going to listen to anything he says. Whatever he says at 6 o'clock tonight, people will not listen to this man because he has lost public trust and people don't believe in what he's saying anymore. And we've had it now for 20 months. People have been obedient. People have complied. People have taken the vaccine. People have done what they've been told. And this makes a sheer mockery of everything that we've sacrificed and people have given over the last 20 months.
But is throwing Boris Johnson under the bus really going to help things? What if it does emerge that he did not know about this party? Downing Street is a fairly cavernous place. It might look fairly quaint and teeny-weeny from the outside, but I'm assured by people who know the building better than I do that it's got many antechambers and rooms where small gatherings might have taken place without the Prime Minister even knowing. Is it not just the case that as a result of all of these regulations, people have got COVID fatigue and are falling out of love with politics and politicians in general, not just Johnson?
Well, look, he obviously knew about it because his advisor was practicing a speech to give at a press conference should there be question about it. So he clearly knew something about it because otherwise, and she's resigned over it. So why was his then advisor practicing at a press conference asking questions about a Christmas party? Clearly he knew about it. This man has lied on public record to the nation. And I don't understand why the opposition, especially in Keir Starmer's position, is just asking for an apology. He should be calling for his resignation. Look, I've worked for people. I've been to Christmas parties like you, Alex. You know, when you've worked for a company, your boss goes there. If the boss doesn't turn up, you know it's happening. Boris knew this was happening, but I'm afraid he will try and bury it. He will hide behind the whole big policing stuff he's got going on and the drugs campaign he's fighting against and all that stuff. He will try to run from this and not be accountable. But I can tell you now that the public mood is that people are angry. They don't trust this government. They don't trust Boris Johnson, and they think he has failed them as a prime minister because when they were burying their grandmothers, his staff were. I was going to swear then, but I won't do that on GB News. His staff were on a booze up in Downing Street, and that to me is morally and ethically wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you actually make a very valid point there about the fact that there was a rehearsed question on the topic of a leak emerging about a party that may or may not have taken place, which does indeed, I think, suggest very much that they knew full well they had done something, which, if it got out, would not look good in the public eye. But does this lead you to also question Sir Keir Starmer's response? You're saying that he didn't call for Boris Johnson, said he hasn't called for the Prime Minister's resignation. Is that because Keir Starmer is also, no doubt, looking over his shoulder? Because he probably can't account for all of the parties that may or may not have taken place among members of the shadow cabinet or out in the constituencies of his MPs.
Well, of course, I've seen a few things on social media this evening where Keir Starmer has been photographed in parties around about the same time. So, you know, it probably relates to that. I think the biggest question here for me is this. I'm not against parties. Even during lockdown, even though people were complying, lots of people didn't because they didn't believe it was the right thing to do. So it's not as though we're against people having parties during these regulations. It's the simple fact that we didn't make the rules and then break the rules. I think that's the hypocrisy. And on Keir Starmer's side, of course, he's trying to make sure that nothing leaks from his side of the benches, because clearly it seems to me as if he was tepid, as if he wasn't all out for Boris. This was an incredible opportunity for some real opposition to really go for Boris today. And Keir Starmer, personally, I believe, failed to do that. And it might be because there's still questions to be asked. Maybe Labour members of the cabinet or Labour members were actually doing something similar themselves. And that's why people have lost, quite frankly, people have lost all confidence in our political system as it is. Our institution is failing people in the country and people are looking for something different. I believe we're living in a post-political world now and people are fed up of politics. But we have democracy. And the only way to beat these people is at the ballot box. And that's an ancient thing, but that's what we've got, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, you're clearly very angry at the ongoing situation and the lies that the Prime Minister may or may not have told. But do you think many people are ready to make their placards and protest? We've heard of perhaps a gathering of people taking place near Downing Street to chant and guffaw at the Prime Minister's actions. But do you think the mood of the nation has indeed changed? Is this going to be a seminal moment, a pivotal moment, do you think, during the COVID narrative?
Yeah, I know that you can't promote this. This is me as a contributor on your show tonight. But I would say that if after 6 o'clock tonight we hear what Boris has to say on restrictions, which make no sense whatsoever, of a virus that hasn't killed, nobody as far as we're aware, and makes you have an headache and make you feel tired. I mean, look, it's ridiculous. It's an overreaction from this government. I would suggest that people get on the streets instead of protests, have a massive street party in Downing Street. Get outside there, and even if he says you can't meet, you should work from home, stuff what he says, get out there and party, because that's what they have done. So why can't we? You know, it's one rule for them and one rule for us. And that has to change. And I think people are, Alex, from my work in the community as a social activist as well, and projects I'm involved in here in Wales and other parts of the UK, people are getting to the point. The pub talk, the rugby club talk is all the same. We've had enough of this government. We've complied and we will not comply anymore. And I think there is going to be a massive reaction to this publicly, and we are going to see more. I know it's winter. I know Christmas is coming, but I don't believe that people are going to listen to Boris Johnson, pay any attention to what he said. How can you trust a politician who gets up and tells us that we can't see our loved ones over Christmas? You have to stay at home. There's restrictions, vaccine passports, all of these measures he's going to bring in, when he himself has flaunted those rules, members of the Senate here in Wales as well, and members of his staff as well. It's incomprehensible to think that people will comply. The only people that will comply will be die-hard Conservative fans of Boris Johnson. The rest of the population will think to themselves, well, you know what? If that man can't keep to the rules and his staff, or at least his staff, then why should I? And I guess that's the general feeling of the country. And I think this is the beginning of the end for Boris Johnson. I know that they've got through the scandals and the smear campaign from Labour on the Conservative benches, what's been happening there. They survived that, but this one is not going away. And I think this is the beginning of the end for Boris Johnson, his premiership. Even the backbenchers. I have had MPs text me tonight and tell me that they've left Westminster, they've left Downing Street today, angry at what Boris Johnson's done, and they've returned to their constituencies.
Richard Taylor, political commentator today. Sounds like he's going to have to buy a pretty large turkey this Christmas. And on his comments about saying to everyone, go out there and party, of course, as an Ofcom regulated news channel, we will not be endorsing festive insurrection. However gleeful it may sound, it would not be the responsible thing to do. And just to remind you, of course, the Prime Minister will be addressing the nation in approximately 10 minutes' time, and we understand that that is likely to be about new COVID regulations. Well, let's take a quick look at some of the footage that was leaked to ITV concerning that party last year.
I've just seen reports on Twitter that there was a Downing Street Christmas party on Friday night. Do you recognise those reports?
I went home. Hold on.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas party?
What's the answer?
I don't know. It wasn't a party, it was cheese and wine. Just be clear, it's not.
Is cheese and wine all right?
No.
It was a business meeting.
I'm joking.
Is this recorded? His fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
And how much her expression was different today as she announced her resignation outside her house, very tearfully and remorsefully. Our reporter Alice Porter takes a look at the events which have led to Allegra Stratton's resignation. We're going to show you her package now.
December 2020, a time when Christmas parties was something most people couldn't even contemplate. But was it a different story at Downing Street? That's the question that has gripped Westminster and now the country. It all began more than a week ago, when the Daily Mirror published allegations that parties were held at Number 10 over the festive period. It said, at the end of November, Boris Johnson allegedly attended a leaving party during the second national lockdown, when indoor social gatherings were banned and police were looking for rule breakers. Then 2 weeks later, on the 16th of December, Boris Johnson announced that London and the South East was moving into Tier 3, which were the toughest restrictions at the time. Indoor social mixing was only allowed between individual households. 2 days later, on the 18th of December, a staff party was allegedly held inside Downing Street. Government guidance at the time stated that people must not have a work Christmas party.
I know how much emotion people invest in this time of year and how important it is, for instance, for grandparents to see their grandchildren, for families to be together. So I know how disappointing this will be. But we have said throughout this pandemic that we must and we will be guided by the science.
Boris Johnson announced that the relaxation of the rules across England for Christmas would not go ahead as planned. And in fact, tougher restrictions would come into force for London and South East England with a new Tier 4, effectively cancelling Christmas for millions of people. These Tier 4 restrictions came into force on the 21st of December. People are forbidden from mixing indoors with anyone from outside their household. Only a day after new measures came into force and 4 days after the alleged party, a mock televised press briefing is held at Downing Street, in which an advisor to the PM is seen joking with Allegra Stratton about the party.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas?
What's the answer?
I don't know. It wasn't a party, it was cheese and wine.
Just be clear, it's not. Is cheese and wine all right?
No.
It was a business meeting.
I'm joking.
This is recorded. His fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
Over the last week, the Prime Minister has repeatedly denied allegations that any rules were broken.
All guidance was followed completely during number 10. All the guidelines were observed, continue to be observed.
Today, however, a U-turn. He's announced the Cabinet Secretary is to investigate claims of the party.
I was also furious to see that clip.
This scandal throws into doubt the trust between the government and its people, a trust which was even more crucial during the pandemic and is now very much under threat. Alice Porter, GB News.
Well, it's been a day of heightened tensions, resignations, peccadillo scandals, half-truths, counter-truths, statements, Prime Minister's questions. But after it all, it is, of course, time for you, the viewer, the voter, the Democrats, to have the final word on the big issue of the day, that party. So let's have a little look at what some of you have been saying. I'm just going to load up my inbox now for want of waiting for someone to give your wonderful reactions to today's stories on the auto cue for me. My computer is being rather slow here. People are saying COVID compliance. People are saying I am disgusted with what people are saying. And it seems to me that the guest is telling people to have a mass party outside number 10 because the government have broken their own rules. So we should do the same. They say his argument is crazy. It would be risking the lives of others. I did say after that announcement that we, of course, as an Ofcom regulated channel, will not be endorsing festive insurrection, however jolly it may sound. A lot of you are saying Johnson twice also broke the IPSO rules and that actually he is that he is not to be relied upon, basically. And someone has said, I am tuning in for the PM's statements, but not for the Downing Street party. We can now pass to Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, who we're trying to get in contact with, who's been lurking around in the cold outside 10 Downing Street this whole time. There he is, Darren. They're keeping me on my toes today, I'm telling you that much. And it seems that the Prime Minister is also being kept on his toes. What's the latest?
Yeah, indeed. Well, we're expecting this press conference to start, in the next 5 minutes or so. They normally start on time. Boris Johnson essentially, probably, almost certainly going to call on the nation, England, to start to be concerned, I think, to a large degree, about the Omicron variant. Now, we're still early days into the actual details of how transmissible it might be, whether it might lead still to mild illness, but there clearly is enough concern within government, Alex, that they feel that further restrictions do need to be applied, and that is why I think we're looking at potentially that return to a work from home rule, which obviously has not been in place for months and months in England. Also the possible introduction of the vaccine passports for large-scale events like football games. So we're still a long way off the restrictions that we had, for example, this time last year. We're not looking at kind of lockdown restrictions, but we are looking at more restrictions on our lives. In some ways, actually bringing us much more into key with what else is happening in the other home nations in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. The question is, will this be enough? And I ask that question not saying or suggesting that maybe the restrictions go further. I say that because Grant Shapps, who's the Transport Secretary, said last week of the restrictions that are currently in place in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland that they didn't seem to be making that much of a noticeable kind of effort in slowing down the Omicron variant, or indeed in case levels at all. And so the question is, even if these restrictions come into place, will they make that much difference? Could the government at some stage have to go further? Will the Prime Minister even suggest that tonight? So there will be questions, of course, about those restrictions, the restrictions that will have an impact on all of our lives. But you're also right in pointing out that clearly there will also be an awful lot of questions about what has happened today, the investigation into that party, and of course the resignation this afternoon of his former advisor, Allegra Stratton.
And in terms of what's going on in tonight's press conference, have you heard any more information about what the Prime Minister is likely to announce? We are, of course, waiting for the Prime Minister to come and address the nation in a couple of moments' time.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, it's going to be around further restrictions. So it's going to be around things like that vaccine passport, about work from home, the so-called kind of Plan B that the government, up until, it must be said, yesterday, Dominic Raab, the former Foreign Secretary, the Justice Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister, was suggesting we're still a long way off. Well, it looks like we're now there. Interestingly, of course, this is all around the concern of the Omicron variant, about whether it can escape some of the efficacies of the vaccines, whether it's more transmissible or not, what type of illness it leads to. Now, what we know provisionally, and we must emphasise that word provisionally, is that it does seem that it is potentially dramatically more transmissible than the Delta variant. That is of real concern, because of what it means that if there is a rise in infections, it's likely to increase much quicker than the Delta variant, which of course was more transmissible than the original coronavirus. In addition to that, that's going to put an awful lot of potential pressure on the NHS at the worst possible time of the year. Now, in terms of the good news around this variant, it is possible, and there is some evidence from South Africa, it leads to potentially milder symptoms in those that are infected, or indeed more asymptomatic cases. Still an awful lot of evidence to gather on that, but the concern from scientists is not merely based on the severity of the disease, it's how quickly it could spread, because that peak, as I say, could be significantly higher if far more people get infected all at the one time, even if it is for most of us relatively mild. And then in addition to that, when it comes to the vaccines, there was a little bit of good news today. We heard from the head of Pfizer suggesting that actually 2 vaccines, so if you're double vaccinated, that is likely to mean that you will be pretty well protected against severe disease, and that a booster jab, a third jab, provides pretty good all-round defensiveness when it comes to this variant. So it's a bit of a mixed picture when it comes to Omicron. The government scientists, the Prime Minister, I'm sure will spell out in more detail. There will still, of course, be lots of unanswered questions, and the talk about they have not got the full detail yet from South Africa, and indeed from the tests they've been carrying out in Portadown here in the UK. But in the end, there's clearly concern enough that they feel that some of these rules and restrictions will have to change, that we will again have to alter aspects of our life, though not to the degree that we found ourselves in this time last year.
Well, as you can see there, we're waiting for the Prime Minister to take to the lectern in the Downing Street briefing room to tell the nation of what his plans are for Christmas when it comes to COVID restrictions. It's just gone 6 o'clock. You are watching GB News with me, Alex Phillips, and we are going to stick with our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, who is looking at both the scandal of that Downing Street party last year and looking ahead at that press conference we're expecting to happen any moment now. Darren, it'll be interesting to see, won't it, what slides particularly the Prime Minister chooses to use to back up any call for further regulations, because we were told from the beginning of the pandemic that actions that we must take for as the general public are there to actually protect the NHS. So will he be looking at a spike in cases? We are being told that Omicron is potentially a far milder form of COVID-19, or will he actually be looking at the rise in case numbers? It's going to be very difficult for the Prime Minister in any case, in the context of this Partygate scandal, to justify placing onerous restrictions on the general public. How do you think he's going to lay that out, Darren?
Yeah, interesting. Of course, you're right in pointing out there will be lots of questions, I've got no doubt, at the end of his presentation about what has gone on in Downing Street last year, and these still unanswered questions about parties. But the main focus I think even for us journalists, will be on these restrictions. You're right in saying that the government have always used, pretty much throughout this entire pandemic, the case numbers can't be the benchmark for restrictions, though we know, of course, when case numbers increase, they do tend to lead to hospitalisations. Now, hospitalisations, I think, around 7,500 across the UK at the moment of people who are in hospital with coronavirus. That is way below the peak back in January. In fact, I think it's pretty much been steady for quite a few weeks now. So that is some form of reassurance. I think the concern comes from, of course, that if you do see a big spike and a exponential growth in the number of cases, and that's the concern about Omicron, is that it is growing at an incredible rate. There are suggestions that the R rate could be somewhere between 2, 3, maybe 3.5. That when you then get a big jump in cases, that would inevitably lead, even if most people find it a relatively mild disease, it will lead to a jump in hospitalisations a couple of weeks later, and that pressure on the National Health Service could play out. But be in no doubt, also the Prime Minister is under an awful lot of pressure from within his own party, from many of his own backbenchers, not to go too far with these restrictions. He has promised that this Christmas is going to be a lot better than it was last. Now, that's a pretty low bar, isn't it? Since we all remember how awful it was last Christmas. But in the end, I think the Prime Minister is going to be cautious potentially with these restrictions, given the fact that there is political pressure for him to look at things like hospitalisations and deaths rather than mere case numbers. He has to balance that politics, doesn't he, with the science. And that's what will be interesting from his presentation about where the science tells us now where we are with this pandemic.
Yeah, also interesting to note regarding the presentation, they spent a lot of money on creating that Downing Street press room, whatever you'd call it, with the lecterns there, a few million quid. And it was supposed to be Allegra Stratton, who was going to be the Prime Minister's spokesperson for the first time, a bit like the model in America, where the President of America always has his spokesperson delivering addresses to the nation. That, of course, never materialised. And now Allegra Stratton has gone. Are you expecting some sort of internal reshuffle in 10 Downing Street, Darren?
Well, so Allegra Stratton, you're right in pointing out, was the press secretary, very briefly it must be said, with Boris Johnson. She then moved on to represent and to work with Alex Phillips, the president of COP, and she was his official spokesperson during that summit, and indeed would have been for the next year, because the UK's chairmanship of COP, if you like, carries on for the entire year. Now, clearly she has left that post this afternoon looking pretty tearful, talking about how she felt distraught looking at that video clip and how it had been perceived, and that she had been seen to make light of some of the lockdown restrictions, and touched upon, of course, people who had lost loved ones over the last year or so. Very, very tearful, Allegra Stratton. But you're right, the questions will not go away for the Prime Minister. There'll be questions about other Downing Street officials who were also in that video. Also, those Downing Street officials who may well have attended a party here in Downing Street in last December, that now Simon Case, who's the Cabinet Secretary, is actively investigating, as is the Metropolitan Police. And in addition to that, there is, again, an awful lot of unanswered questions about other parties that may well have taken place in Downing Street in December and November of last year. Parties that is suggested by some that the Prime Minister himself may well have attended, that frankly were certainly not inside the guidance, and for some not inside the rules of what was in place here in London at that time. And all this, of course, while Conservative backbenchers are pretty furious, Alex, this evening, that, again, the government seem to have got themselves into a mess about maybe not being as open and transparent as they should have been when these allegations first emerged last week. The Prime Minister reiterating today that he had sought assurances and been given assurances that a party wasn't held or that the rules were stuck to. That seems a pretty untenable position now, given the fact that one of his advisors has resigned over this issue, and he himself has launched an investigation into what precisely may well have happened.
Yeah, it sounds like a Met Police helicopter's flying over your head. There you are, of course, standing outside Downing Street on this cold night. Well done, you. Earlier on, Darren, you were talking to us that there might have been protesters beginning to amass near the entrance to Downing Street in shock and anger at the revelations of this leaked footage today. What's the scene like there now?
It's pretty quiet at the moment, let's say. There has been an awful lot of protesters today, a whole range, but there does normally be here in Downing Street people who've got one cause or another who are protesting. But you're right, there was a pretty vocal one earlier on.
I'm going to stop you there, Darren. The Prime Minister's just behind the lectern.
Omicron variant, this government acted introducing targeted and proportionate measures as a precaution whilst our scientists discovered more, and we're learning more every day. We don't yet know Omicron's severity, its exact rate of transmission, nor indeed the full effectiveness of our vaccines against it. But since I last spoke to you, it's become increasingly clear that Omicron is growing much faster than the previous Delta variant, and it's spreading rapidly all around the world. 568 cases have been confirmed through genomic sequencing across every region of the UK, and the true number is certain to be much higher. Most worryingly, there is evidence that the doubling time of Omicron in the UK could currently be between 2 and 3 days. And while there are some limits on what we can learn from South Africa because of the different rates of vaccination, different rates of previous infection, we're seeing growth in cases here in the UK that now mirrors the rapid increases previously seen in South Africa. And South Africa is also seeing hospitalizations roughly doubling in a week, meaning that we can't yet assume that Omicron is less severe than previous variants. So while the picture may get better, and I sincerely hope that it will, we know that the remorseless logic of exponential growth could lead to a big rise in hospitalizations and therefore, sadly, in deaths. And that's why it's now the proportionate and the responsible thing to move to Plan B in England, while continuing to work closely with our colleagues in the devolved administrations, so we slow the spread of the virus, buy ourselves the time to get yet more boosters into arms, and especially in the older and more vulnerable people, and understand the answers to the key outstanding questions about Omicron. So, first, we will reintroduce the guidance to work from home. Guidance to work from home. Employers should use the rest of the week to discuss working arrangements with their employees, but from Monday, you should work from home if you can. Go to work if you must, but work from home if you can. All right? I know this will be hard for many people, but by reducing your contacts in the workplace, you will help slow transmission. Second, from this Friday, we will further extend the legal requirement to wear a face mask to most public indoor venues, including theatres and cinemas. There will be, of course, exceptions where it's not practical, such as when eating, drinking, exercising, or singing. Third, we'll also make the NHS COVID pass mandatory for entry into nightclubs and venues where large crowds gather, including unseated indoor venues with more than 500 people, unseated outdoor venues with more than 4,000 people, and any venue with more than 10,000 people. The NHS COVID pass can still be obtained with 2 doses, but we will keep this under review as the boosters roll out. And having taken clinical advice since the emergence of Omicron, a negative lateral flow test will also be sufficient. As we set out in Plan B, we will give businesses a week's notice, so this will come into force in a week's time, helping to keep these events and venues open at full capacity, while giving everyone who attends them confidence that those around them have done the responsible thing to minimise risk to others. As Omicron spreads in the community, we will also introduce daily tests for contacts instead of isolation, so we keep people safe while minimising the disruption to daily life. And of course, we will take every step to ensure our NHS is ready for the challenges ahead. But the single biggest thing that every one of us can do is to get our jabs, and crucially to get that booster as soon as our turn arrives. 1 year to the day since the UK became the first country in the world to administer a COVID vaccine into the arms of Margaret Keenan, we've opened up the vaccine booster to all those over 40, and we're reducing the gap between second dose and booster to a minimum of just 3 months. Our heroic NHS staff and volunteers have already done almost 21 million boosters, including reaching 84% of all the eligible over 80s. But we need to go further and faster still, because our scientists are absolutely confident that your immune response will be stronger if you've been boosted. And while you're at it, please get your flu jab too. Let's do everything we can to protect ourselves and our loved ones this winter and to reduce the pressures on our NHS. As we learn more, so we will be guided by the hard medical data around 4 key criteria: the efficacy of our vaccines and our boosters, the severity of Omicron, the speed of its spread, and the rate of hospitalizations. We will constantly monitor the data and keep it under review. And of course, we must be humble in the face of this virus. But if, and indeed as soon as, it becomes clear that the boosters are capable of holding this Omicron variant, and we've boosted enough people to do that job of keeping Omicron in equilibrium, then we will be able to move forward as before. So please, everybody, play your part and get boosted. I'm now going to hand over to Chris to do the slides.
Thank you, Prime Minister. First slide, please. I wanted to situate this initially on where we are with Delta, because what's happening is Omicron is coming on the back of a still high rate of Delta transmission and hospitalisation. So in the first slide, what we have is the number of people testing positive for COVID in the UK, and that has been drifting upwards, not at a very rapid rate, but it has been drifting upwards. The Omicron data aren't really going to be visible in this for a few days, but they will become visible over time. Next slide, please. The number of people in the hospital with COVID in the UK has, because of the booster vaccination programme in particular, been drifting down until this point in time, with the numbers going into hospital reducing, although that's now stabilised slightly. And that's really because the boosters are particularly going to protect and are protecting people who are in the highest risk categories, as the Prime Minister has said. Next slide, please. And in terms of our major countermeasures, of course, the biggest one, as the Prime Minister has said, is boosting. And this is steadily increasing. So we now have over a third of those who are eligible have already had a booster, and they are, by and large, the most vulnerable third. But there's still people who are in higher risk groups who have not been boosted. And of course, we have to move down those groups. And that is going to become absolutely critical, we think, as we move on into a period when Omicron becomes significant and probably then becomes dominant. Next slide, please. And if this is just a data just to show quite how effective, with the variants we've had to date, vaccination can be. And what it compares is, in the dark lines, the hospitalisation rate in the blue-black bars in those who are unvaccinated, and in the orange bars, those who are vaccinated with 2 doses. This is largely protecting against Delta. But as you can see, at every age, a really substantial improvement in your protection. Next slide, please. So now we move on to the data on Omicron, and these are data probably people have seen versions of in media over the last few days, but I think they do need fleshing out a bit. So these are the number of people testing positive for COVID-19 in South Africa. At this point in time, the big increase in COVID in South Africa is virtually all the Omicron variant. And this is now spread all around South Africa. And as you can see, this is an incredibly steep increase in rates. And we're now seeing this translating into increases in hospitalisation. So, for example, I was talking to some of my colleagues from South Africa this afternoon, and they were saying that informal data still to be added to, but there was around about a 300% increase on hospitalisations over the last week. So some of those will have come in with Omicron, and some of them will come in as a result of Omicron. But the fact is, those numbers are going up very sharply. Next slide, please. So what over the last week. Some of those will have come in with Omicron, and some of them will come in as a result of Omicron. But the fact is those numbers are going up very sharply. Next slide, please. So what's happening here in the UK? Well, I'm afraid that the data here are now clear. What you can see here is the number on the left, and on the right the percentage of cases with what's called S gene target failure. This is a marker of Omicron. Virtually all the cases now who've got this marker will have Omicron. A very small number at the bottom will not. And as you can see, whether you look at the absolute count or the percentage, this is going up incredibly fast now. And as the Prime Minister has said, this is doubling at this point in time. It may slow down, and the aim of the measures announced by the Prime Minister is to slow things down, but it's doubling currently between 2 and 3 every 2 and 3 days. That is an extraordinarily fast rate, and you therefore can get, with very small numbers to very large numbers, really quite quickly. Now, the question obviously people reasonably want to ask is, will this feed through to people in hospital, and how quickly? And I think I'd just like to just point out two realities. First of all, the first one is a good one. At the moment, the spread is in younger people who you would not expect to go into hospital, and it's once it starts moving up the ages and into vulnerable groups that you'll start to see that. So there will be a lag as it moves into more vulnerable groups. And then we know from previous waves, and this is not particularly surprising, that there is a delay between people becoming infected with COVID and ending up with symptoms and then with hospitalisation. So there's usually about a 2-week delay. We would therefore not expect that these cases, that the case rates in hospital will start to go up for a number of probably 2 to 3 weeks. And in that period, if you're doubling up at the speed we're talking about now, we move from very small numbers to really substantial numbers, and it will keep on doubling. And that really is the reason why these measures have been announced by the Prime Minister as agreed by ministers today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris. Patrick, anything you want to add? Okay, good. Well, let's go to members of the public then. Dave from Chester.
Are mandatory vaccinations being considered, like they are in the EU and other global nations? And if not, why? Why is it acceptable to put measures on our freedoms, but not that on our vaccination statuses?
Thanks, Dave. Well, I said right at the beginning of this pandemic that I think, or as soon as we were really talking about vaccination seriously, that I didn't want us to have a society and a culture where we force people to get vaccinated. I don't think that's ever been the way we do things in this country. And actually, Dave, we've been able to achieve through the voluntarism of the British people, through their incredible public spiritedness, willingness to roll up their sleeves and get vaccinated, huge numbers, huge proportions of our population. I think that there is going to come a point if we can show that the vaccines are capable of holding of Omicron, and that's the key thing that I think that we need to test. Well, I do think that we're going to have a conversation about ways in which we deal with this pandemic, because I want to be absolutely clear with you. I don't believe we can keep going indefinitely with non-pharmaceutical interventions. I mean restrictions on people's way of life, where just because a substantial proportion of the population still, sadly, has not got vaccinated. And I think we're going to need to have a national conversation about the way forward and the other things that we can do to protect those who are hard to reach, who haven't got vaccinated for one reason or another, who may have medical reasons why they can't get vaccinated, other ways of protecting them. But that is a stage that I think we will come to if and when we establish, as I hope that we will, that the booster is effective against Omicron, and the booster is capable of holding Omicron, getting us back into that equilibrium that the double jabs got us into with Delta, if you follow me. So it's at that moment I think we will have to talk seriously about moving on from the way from thinking about further NPIs and thinking about other ways in which we we protect people. Rachel from Essex. Rachel asks, why can't fully vaccinated British travellers stuck in red-listed countries self-isolate at home when they return instead of a hotel? Quarantine hotels are too expensive, especially as this was implemented at short notice, not giving travellers a chance to get home. Well, Rachel, I think that's a very fair challenge. I think that given the way Omicron is now seeded around the world and not just in red-listed countries, I think we will be looking at the red list and the way that we do it. But it's been very important in the immediate period, the immediate response to Omicron, to have very tough border measures to slow the arrival of the variant in this country, and that was the objective of those measures, and continues to be the objective. I mean, Chris, Patrick, anything you want to add to that? Okay, then let's go straight to Laura Kuhnsberger, BBC News.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. You're tightening the rules again for millions of people tonight. How can you stand at that lectern, exactly where some of your team laughed and joked about COVID rules, and tell people they must now follow your new instructions? And are you really asking the public to believe that you had no idea what was going on under your own roof?
Actually, the first thing I want to say, thanks very much, Laura. The first thing I want to say is that I know that today Allegra Stratton has resigned, and I wanted to pay tribute to her, because she has been, in spite of what everybody has seen, and again, I make no excuses for the frivolity with which the subject was handled in that rehearsal that people saw in that clip, and there could be no excuse for it. And it was I can totally understand how infuriating it was. But I want to say that Allegra has been a fine colleague, has achieved a great deal in her time in government, and was a particularly effective spokesman for COP26. She coined the coal, cars, cash, trees agenda, and helped really to marshal and to rally the world behind the agreement in COP26. And I really, Laura, if you forgive me, I wanted to say that, because I think it's been a sad day for her as well, as an infuriating event for many people around the country. And on that point, look, I want to repeat that the fundamental point is that I think the British public, notwithstanding the point that you make, can see the vital importance of the medical information that we're giving, and they can see the need to take it to heart and to act upon it. And that point has been proved time and time again. And it's never been more conspicuous in the way that the public has responded to the vaccine rollout, and the way that they've done the responsible thing. So I take my encouragement from the way the public have dealt with it themselves. Anushka Astana of ITV.
Prime Minister, you've only really agreed to an investigation into what happened on December the 18th last year because of the video that emerged from this room. And Allegra Stratton's resignation seems to further suggest that a party took place despite the denials. But we've also had serious allegations about parties on 3 other occasions. So I want to ask you why they aren't being investigated. Is it because you haven't been caught out in those cases, or is it because reports are true that you attended some of them? And to the rest of you here, can I ask how worried you are about whether this undermines public trust? Because the polling suggests that it does do, and Conservative MPs are openly saying that it's very hard now to mandate the public to act.
Thanks very much, Anushka. Well, I repeat what I said in the House and earlier today. The Cabinet Secretary will conduct an inquiry into into what took place on December the 18th. As for other events that other dates that you mentioned, as far as I'm aware, to the best of my knowledge, and we have followed the rules throughout, and that is what you would expect. Indeed, we followed the rules. As far as I'm aware, the rules were followed on December the 18th as well. And I just repeat that point. But it's clearly important that the Cabinet Secretary is able to get to the bottom of it. But in the meantime, on your sort of your global, your big point again, Anushka, which is really the same as Laura's, I think overwhelmingly the public see the importance of the messages that they are getting via this medium. It is imperfect. We do what we can to explain what we think is necessary. I know it's contentious. I know it's difficult, and I know that sometimes the messages are confusing. We do our absolute best to make it as clear as possible, and we do everything that we can to protect public health. That's what we're driven by. But Chris and Patrick, you were asked.
I mean, the measures work because people follow them, and that's been shown time and time again during this. So it's incredibly important everyone follows it. It's everybody. It was incredibly important throughout. It's going to be incredibly important going forward, and it only works if we all do it. And we're now facing a viral variant that's rapidly progressing. It's got a doubling time of between 2 and 3 days. And measures need to be taken to try and slow the spread of that variant, as well as, and I think this is important, us all boosting our own defences by getting a booster jab. So I think the rules are there, quite carefully thought through and given scientific evidence, and they're there because they're important and they're there for everybody to stick to.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I mean, I think we all know that people get very angry, including colleagues and friends, and when they feel that it's unfair. And the Prime Minister said that in the House of Commons, and he said it today. That's quite different from people, I think, wanting to actually know what's going on and then make decisions. And I think those two need to be separated. And the point about what we're trying to do is trying to actually say, look, here are the reasons. This is moving very fast, doubling every 2 to 3 days. It is too early for us to be absolutely confident about hospitalisations, but I think you've seen how things have gone before. That's probably the way to bet. And then if we're pleasantly surprised, no one will be happier than I would be, and Patrick and the Prime Minister. We know that it looked as if he was going to be able to evade vaccination, and now clinically we know that it can in terms of infection. So we know that is an issue. Therefore, the boosters become significantly more important. And we know that we're going early now so as to try and be able to slow this down at an early stage of events. And I think if it's laid out to people in a way that is reasonable, irrespective of other things, people want to know the logic as to why they're doing it, and I hope we're trying to lay out the logic of trying to do that. That's not in any way to try and move away from the earlier point, but I just think those two should be kept separate in people's minds.
Thanks very much, Chris. Beth Rigby, Sky.
Prime Minister, on Allegra Stratton's resignation, she resigned today. She looked broken as she did it. How did you feel when you watched that statement and watched what she said, heard what she said? And doesn't it lead to your leadership being questioned if others are taking responsibility for things that happen in this place instead of you taking responsibility? And to the scientists, people are going to feel pretty flat today listening to this press conference. They were told to get their jabs, to get their boosters, that we would have an irreversible path out of lockdown, that life would continue. Winter comes, we are now being told that we have to live with restrictions again. Is this just the reality of living with COVID? So this is not just another year this is happening, but this is our lives now for years to come. I think people will be worried about that. Thank you.
Yes, just Beth, first on your first point, look, I repeat what I said to Laura. I think that Allegra has been an outstanding spokesperson for the government, for COP. She did an extraordinary job, and I'm very, very sorry to lose her. And on your point about responsibility, I don't just take responsibility for things that happen in this building. I take responsibility for everything that happens in this government, and I've made that clear throughout the pandemic.
On the question about where we are now and what that means for the future, this virus has mutated a lot quickly, and that is sort of what you'd expect at this stage, that you start to see more mutations. This one's got a lot more than anyone thought would arrive that quickly, and that's what's caused so many concerns about it, spreading very fast. The good news is that So far, it looks as though when you get very high antibody levels with the booster vaccine, it's definitely having some effect against it in the laboratory studies. We need to watch and see what happens over the next few weeks as we get more data on that. So the boosters remain incredibly important as a way of increasing immunity. What we're on is a road from pandemic to endemic, where this becomes a more sort of regular infection like flu or something over time. But we're in a sort of bumpy transition for that. And that's going to be difficult. And it is difficult now. And there are special measures that need to happen now to try and reduce the spread. It doesn't mean this is what happens in perpetuity. You would expect that over time, this becomes a virus which then has peaks every year, just in the way that flu does, perhaps. But it wouldn't be endlessly having new variants that always escape vaccines to some extent. You would also expect that the vaccine will need to change over time, just as the flu vaccine changes year on year, and you get a slightly different one because the thing continues to evolve a bit. So I think this is a surprise change that's happened. It's a big one, and yes, it's going to make everyone feel a bit sort of deflated about it, but there are things that can be done. I think the vaccines are going to hold up to some extent here, and I think probably boosters will really push that to a level that's going to be important. We need to test that and find out. And I don't think it's a harbinger of what happens hereafter. We will see more variants, and they will always cause some sort of challenge, but that challenge is the same sort of challenge that you're going to see year on year with other things as well over time.
Can I just add to that? Because, I mean, I obviously completely agree. We're in a sort of transition period from a point when the pandemic first hit in 2020, where we had to rely entirely on social measures and had no medical countermeasures. We will get to a stage where we have multiple countermeasures, probably lots of different types of vaccines, antivirals we currently don't, a whole variety of other ways, which is the way we have dealt now with very many infectious diseases. We're in that midpoint. We are immeasurably better off now than we were with the vaccines we've got, with drugs, with better hospital treatment. There's a whole bunch of things that are so much better than they were. It will be much quicker getting over this than it would have been if the same situation had hit us a year ago. But we shouldn't, at no point have we said that there wouldn't be new variants, significant ones potentially, and vaccine escape ones. That's been said by almost I suspect every media outlet that's represented here repeatedly, and for good reasons. That's the biological inevitability. Now, when it comes to this particular, so in the long run, I think the outlook is good, but I think we have to accept that it's not, there's still a difficult period. And in terms of this particular variant, the question I think is really going to be, is this held by the current vaccines with boosters, or are we actually going to have to do a reformulation of the vaccine, at least for more vulnerable people, and that is what we will need to do over time? And it may be actually what we have is a transition period where the booster holds it for a bit, and that buys us time, and then we can actually get a specific or what's called polyvalent vaccine, and that will allow us then to, from later on in this year, be able to respond to it directly. So I think we should, in a sense, what I think we should say is I can see why people would feel deflated, but this is a kind of setback. This is not a situation where we're back to square one. We're having to just deal with it as we always thought we might have to.
Said that you were furious about the video you saw about the mock press conference.
Yes.
How did you feel when you saw Allegra?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Because of the huge press of meetings so far today, I haven't been able to see that, but I'm of course aware of what Allegra has said, and I just repeat what I said. I'm very grateful to her for everything that she's done, and I wish her all the very best, and we will certainly miss her here in government. But I just want to add to what Chris has said on this crucial period, because I think that there is at least a strong possibility that we will discover in the course of the next few days and weeks that indeed the combination of two jabs and a booster is capable of holding Omicron in equilibrium in the way that we want. And then, as I said, we will be able to move forward. And it's always worth bearing in mind that what we're doing today with Plan B is something that we set out back in September. So this is not a deviation from the position that we thought we might find ourselves in as winter set in. We always reckoned that we'd see a spike in disease and in infection. Actually, Delta has been remarkably stable. The problem has been this sudden emergence of Omicron and the real spike that it's producing. And given the potential numbers that Omicron could produce, we just have to respond today in the way that we are. Pippa Crerar from the Mirror.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I thought I'd have another go at Anushka's question because I don't think you quite answered it. Can I ask why you've tasked Simon Case with investigating a party on December the 18th last year that you weren't at, rather than one on November the 27th, where you gave a speech that you were at, in breach of the rules by any reasonable legal analysis? And further to that, will you extend the inquiry, Simon Case's inquiry, to include any other gatherings, events, parties, use the term that you choose, that took place in number 10 or indeed in your flat, if there is evidence of them?
So first of all, Pippa, this is a huge, as people know, this is a massive Department of State, and there are people working flat out the whole time, working on all sorts of issues, and they work extremely hard. And according to very, very well respected civil servants and advisors, special advisors that I've talked to about what happened in the events that you describe, no rules were broken. I've asked Simon Case to look at the other Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, to look at the December the 18th event. I'm sure he'll be considering all sorts of things. But as far as I'm concerned, all the evidence I can see is that people in this building have stayed within the rules. If that turns out not to be the case, and people wish to bring allegations to my attention or to the police or whoever, then of course there will be proper sanctions. But in the meantime, I think what we should do is let Simon get on with, let the Cabinet Secretary get on with his job, and I'm sure he'll be making his findings public as soon as possible. Ben.
Are you restricting him to looking at December the 18th? I mean, that's the part of the question.
The guidance has been, and the rules have been observed at all times, and he's looking at the issue of the 18th of December. He may wish to look at other things. That's a matter, frankly, for him. Ben Wright-Smith of The Telegraph.
Thank you, Prime Minister. 3 quick ones. Tory MPs have suggested you pulled this announcement forward to bounce headlines about the Christmas party. Is that true? On Christmas parties and nativities, what's your message now to the country? Is it those should be cancelled? And there's no time limit at all to these new restrictions or when they might be considered. When do you think the earliest point that might be? Mid-January, February or spring? And a quick one for Professor Whitty, just picking up on your point about reformulating the vaccines. Do you think there's a real possibility a lot of people might need a 4th vaccine before next autumn to counter Omicron?
Right, thanks very much, Ben. So look, on the first point, we'll just imagine the counterfactual. Colleagues say, or people say that we're somehow making this announcement to coincide with events in politics. Well, actually, imagine if this step were to have been delayed because of political events of one kind or another. What would people say then? You've got to act to protect public health when you've got the clear evidence, and I think I'm right in saying that SAGE only met yesterday to discuss this. The evidence about the transmissibility of the virus has we've been watching it for days, but it's become, I'm afraid, unmissable, not just in South Africa, but in this country as well. And if you delay, as everybody knows, with a doubling time of 2.5 to 3 days, you see more doublings, and your position becomes predictably and inevitably worse and more difficult to recover from. On Christmas, the best way to ensure we all have a Christmas as close to normal as possible is to get on with Plan B. Irritating though it may be, it is not a lockdown. It is Plan B. It is what we set out a while back, and to get your boosters and get your jabs. That's the best way forward. And as for when we'll review the measures, Ben, which I think was your third point, as I say, no later than early January, and possibly before, if we start to get some of that really granular information. But we need to see the data and work on it pretty hard.
Christmas parties and nativity should do that.
Good. No, they should not. No. So thank you, Ben. No, in my view, they should not be. They should follow the guidance, of course, but we're not saying we don't want kids to be taken out of school before the end of term. Not that there's a very long to go now. We don't want nativity plays to be cancelled. We think that it's okay currently on what we can see to keep going with Christmas parties. But obviously, everybody should exercise due caution, have ventilation, wash your hands, get a test before you go, a sensible thing to do. Give yourself or give everybody else at the party the confidence that they're going to be meeting someone who is not contagious. Those are simple things that people can do, but that's what we're saying.
On the question you asked me, I think it's far too early to be sure on this. A lot of scientists are doing a lot of work at the moment just to work out what the current 2 doses and different combinations of those and the booster will do with the Omicron variant. And that will help give us some information. I think until then, it's probably not very helpful to speculate. The exception to that is that there's a very small group, but a very important group of people who've got significant immunosuppression who we're giving 3 doses to as their primary course. They will then get a 4th dose, which is essentially their booster dose. So in that group, the answer is yes. But in the great majority of people at this point, I think the answer is we'll have to wait and see what the data show.
Just to build on that, I mean, we've now got vaccine design that allows you to alter them quite easily and to make, as Chris said, so-called multivalent or polyvalent vaccines against different variants in one go. Those are going to provide breadth of coverage in the future. When they'll be needed, we don't know. We've also got antiviral drugs coming through now. 2 have been reported recently, which have good effects. So there are increasing number of options to look at this. But, and this is important, going back to the timing point, SAGE met last week and met again yesterday, on both occasions, saying that this is spreading rapidly. You don't just watch it spreading rapidly. You need to do something. And that isn't just the boosters. The boosters are incredibly important, but it's also about trying to reduce the possibility of spread, which means reducing social contacts in order to try and achieve that.
Thank you. Emilio Casalicchio from Politico.
Thanks, Prime Minister. You just suggested that Simon Case could extend this probe beyond just this alleged party on the 18th. The Permanent Secretary for the Department for Education today said that party that happened in DFE that they apologised for will be included in that probe. So obviously, it's quite flexible. So would you encourage Simon Case to look at all allegations of all parties that might have happened in Downing Street last year? And also, would you commit to the inquiry being published before the end of the year? How quickly would you like to see it done?
Yeah.
And then I've got a question for the scientists, maybe all 3 of you. Obviously, you've just announced new restrictions, including a recommendation from work from home. Is the fact that we're here doing this now not a mark of failure? We should have fixed the roof while the sun was shining, surely, with the pandemic. Prepare the vaccine booster rollout so it could have been done at lightning speed, but instead it's been quite slow to get this new part of the rollout sorted. Actually created a proper world-beating test and trace system, but it feels like we're still not quite there yet as well. We went through devastation last year, but it feels like we still haven't completely learned our lessons. And when are we going to learn? Because next time we might be hit by a virus that's much more dangerous than the pandemic. So are we going to be actually ready by then?
Right. Well, look, I mean, Emilia, can I just go back on some of the things you've just said? I think it is worth people bearing in mind that there are a lot of countries in our immediate neighbourhood that have got restrictions already far tougher than ours and tougher than the ones that we're asking people to implement now, much tougher. And I think people should also bear it, and that's because we had the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, Emilio, just to remind you of that. And it is also the case, far from having a sluggish vaccine rollout, what we've now got is, I think, 21 million people having a booster. Right, we've now got 21 million people boosted. And again, I think I'm right in saying that we've boosted more people than any comparable country, and certainly faster than any other European country. So I'm not going to hear any a criticism of the NHS or the GPs or the pharmacists or the volunteers or everybody who's worked blindingly hard to get this done as fast as they possibly can. Yes, I think what I think is fair, Emilio, is to say that we now need to go much further and much faster, and in our, asking people to make further sacrifices as we are with Plan B. We've got to step up that booster campaign, and it's got to grow wings. And we the pledge that everybody over 18 will get the offer of a booster by the end of January. I want to see us deliver that, and I want to see such a huge rate of booster vaccination in this country that if, as I hope, the boosters can hold Omicron, then we can get back to the road that we were on. That's what we're trying to achieve. And on your other point about the Cabinet Secretary, as far as I'm concerned, he's got to get to the bottom of what he thinks is appropriate and right. But I repeat my view that to the best of my knowledge, everything I've been told is that the rules were followed. But if that doesn't turn out to be the case, then there will be the appropriate sanctions. Yes, as I said in the House today, as soon as possible.
Shall I first go on?
Yes.
Actually, want to add on the wider one. I mean, there are multiple points you put there, and I'll try and give a very brief answer. Short version on pandemic. Of course, we have to plan ahead, but remember that every pandemic is different. The last pandemic that is as bad as this one, and you can certainly conceptualize very, very bad alternative ones, was HIV, a sexually transmitted infection, completely different way you approach it. So the idea that somehow something you can just take off the shelf and that's your pandemic plan, every single time you have to readjust it according to what you find. This is a very serious pandemic. Second general point is inevitably there have been bumps along the road and things we would do differently if we had done them again. That's obvious. But actually, the idea that a new variant, which we knew was going to come, everyone's been accepting that, is somehow a failure, I think is a misunderstanding of the biology. So speaking as a doctor, you expect problems to occur. When they occur, you address them scientifically and rapidly. And if I can just make one plea on behalf of my colleagues who do the operational side, whether on the NHS or elsewhere, quite a lot of those, I'll put this mildly as I can, quite a lot of those who say, isn't it ridiculous, it's going so slowly, have not got as much experience of running national programmes as maybe they might want to have to make those kind of comments. Actually, these things are difficult, and I think the people who are doing it magnificently, personally.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say exactly that. There are two things I'd pull out. First of all, I think Vaccines Task Force was foresighted to make sure that we had enough boosters for this winter. It wasn't inevitable that we would need boosters, and they got the supply in advance ready to be able to do that. And I think the NHS rollout involving people right the way across the country has been one that we should be proud of, actually. I think it's an operational point, not a science point for me, but I think I look at them and think they've done a great job of getting that out. And you look across other countries and you'll see the booster campaign here has been very effective. So I'd like to thank them for everything they've done, actually, in getting those out, both of those groups. And then I'd like also to say that if you look at the 100-day mission that we published at the time of the G7, that was precisely about trying to make sure all of the parts, from surveillance through to rapid production of vaccines and therapeutics, through to what needs to happen for finance and getting this across the world and equitable access, can be improved right the way across the world, so that for any new infection going forward, there is a roadmap to try and get this done more quickly and more efficiently than was possible this time. And so I think making sure that 100-day mission, which the G7 endorsed, is something that really is taken up right the way across the world, is going to be crucially important.
Good. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Good.
In England, and that is in the face of, I think, what is the acute concern of government.
There we go. That was the Prime Minister speaking live in Downing Street, announcing that England is going to move essentially into Plan B. He argued it is not a lockdown, but there will be further restrictions imposed on our lives in the days and weeks to come. Just to talk you through some of what they are, we know, for example, we will all be encouraged, guidance to work from home from Monday if you can. Clearly there will be millions of people, particularly those in lower paid jobs where that is not possible. For those that can, the guidance from Monday will be to work from home. Face masks will now be extended from the end of this week to more indoor venues like cinemas and theatres. In addition to that, it looks like COVID passports are going to be introduced in England for the first time from next week. They will include in indoor venues of people over 500 where they have gathered, and in outside venues where over 4,000 people have gathered. This is the first time that England will have introduced vaccine passports. Of course, they are already at play in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. In addition to that, the Prime Minister, really interesting, and this is what I think was probably the most notable thing Boris Johnson said during that press conference, he is not now ruling out mandatory vaccinations here in the UK. He said that there needs to be a national conversation about moving from thinking about lockdown measures to protecting people. Clearly, there are also lots of questions about what people should do when it comes to Christmas parties. Many have already cancelled, haven't they, over the last couple of days and weeks. They have said that they are pretty disappointed that many of them can't go ahead. It's had a big impact on the restaurant and pub chain, hasn't it? Well, the Prime Minister is saying that people should still have Christmas parties if they want to. Though some might say, and I don't want to pick holes in this, it does seem a little odd that you are being told to work from home, but you can come in if you want to have a work Christmas party. I'm sure there will be further questions on that. And clearly, in large regard, there were lots of questions, weren't there, on the side issue about what may well have happened here in Downing Street a year ago. We know the Prime Minister has obviously launched that investigation, or got Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, to do so, to get to the bottom of a party on the 18th of December. He did concede that Simon Case may well look at allegations of other parties inside Downing Street. However, he said that as far as he's aware, to the best of his knowledge, that the rules have been followed throughout in the end. Still lots of questions unanswered. People want to know whether he potentially attended any of those parties. Also want to know, frankly, if Simon Case will look, and maybe the police as well, at those parties, whether they broke lockdown rules in either November or December time. Coming back, though, to the big news tonight, which is the imposition of those restrictions on our lives here in England, which in some ways actually bring us more into line with what else is happening in the United Kingdom. Many of these restrictions around face coverings and COVID passports are already in place in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. There is disquiet, it must be said, quite a lot of disquiet within the Conservative Party tonight. Here in Westminster, Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, who was speaking in the Commons at the same time as the Prime Minister. He got jeered by some of his own MPs, some calling for a vote on all of this, with an expectation that there could be a significant rebellion. A lot of Conservative MPs not at all very happy about the prospect that vaccine passports could be brought into place here in England. And also, interestingly, Douglas Ross, who is a Conservative MP, but also the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, tweeted within minutes of the Prime Minister's press conference, saying that there is no evidence that vaccine passports stop the spread of COVID. I didn't vote for them at Holyrood, and I will not be voting for them at Westminster. A sign, I think, of some of the discontent there is within the Conservative Party about this. In the end, though, given the fact that the Labour Party are pretty much behind the government on these restrictions. In fact, Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, was arguing in some regards the government should have been doing this a long time ago. It is likely in any vote, of course, the government would win that vote, but there will be disquiet, of course, about these further restrictions. So ultimately, in the end, from essentially starting on Friday with that mandate around face masks, working from home from Monday, and from at some point next week, the extension of the coronavirus passport here to England, there will be these restrictions. The Prime Minister, though, arguing that these is not a lockdown, that we're not going back into lockdown restrictions that we saw, of course, ahead of Christmas next year. But there clearly is concern, and we heard it there expressed in from Chris Whitty and from Sir Patrick Vallance, about the sheer spread of this new variant. We know that cases have exploded in South Africa, that hospitalisations, the Prime Minister said, had doubled there in the space of a matter of weeks. And the concern is, given how highly transmissible this virus is, or this variant of the virus, Omicron, that action needs to be taken, and it needs to be taken now. I don't know if you remember that graph, but you could see the number of cases increasing exponentially, and that is the concern, that the sheer number of cases means that even if for most people it remains a very mild illness, and frankly it remains asymptomatic for some, that you could just see a big increase in hospitalisations because so many